interested in yours because I'm working on it now. Disability lives matter. So I'm working on helping disabled get more respect in the communities and so on.
Oh, that's wonderful.
See if we can put this together. A lot of work.
Well, we're
actually tired, people say.
We're streaming live now, so this is Millennia and Microcosm week 5. Douglas, did you have something you wanted to say about that?
No, just to let you know, because when you talked about what you're doing with the medical and so on, I said we should hook up sometime or something. It would be interesting.
Great. Yeah, okay. I would love to. So we are still in chapter 2, Time, History, and Nature, the introduction to the book Millennia and Microcosm. We finished the opening paragraph, which was dense and full of meaning, and now we're really starting into the section that summarizes the ancient perspective. And this is, again, very rich. He spent a lot of time writing this and putting his references in there to try to make it say a lot of things at the same time. I did some prep for this week to try to make sure I could do justice to this. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Okay, a quote from the passage. Most moderns are passengers fated by their malformed consciousness to go down with this Titanic.
Yes.
Oh, it's a thought I've had, actually. I spent most of my life, just enjoying myself, watching science fiction films, and hey, the bigger society, the big society will take care of itself. I'll just find my own little deck chair on the Titanic and be happy. And I've got a strange feeling now. It's unfortunate. I think I'll be ignorance is bliss, but I'm looking around and thinking, and this is purely in terms of culture, that I'm on a sinking ship.
Yes. Yes, that is a theme he explores a great deal here. I'm going to share a link. This is to an essay by Paul Valéry called Crisis of the Mind. He wrote it in 1919, and it's one of Kenneth Smith's favorites. It's one of my favorites too. And I'm going to read you a little section from this that's relevant to the quote, Stephen, that you raised. So he says, "We later civilizations, we too know that we are mortal. We had long heard tell of whole worlds that had vanished, of empires sunk without a trace, gone down with all their men and all their machines into the unexplored depths of the centuries, with their gods and their laws, their academies and their sciences pure and applied, their grammars and their dictionaries, their classics, their romantics, their symbolists, their critics and the critics of their critics. We were aware that the visible earth is made of ashes and that ashes signify something. Through the obscure depths of history, we could make out the phantoms of great ships laden with riches and intellect. We could not count them, but the disasters that had sent them down were, after all, none of our affair. Elam, Nineveh, Babylon were but beautiful vague names, and the total ruin of those worlds had as little significance for us as their very existence. But France, England, Russia, these too would be beautiful names. Lusitania, too, is a beautiful name. And we see now that the abyss of history is deep enough to hold us all. We are aware that a civilization has the same fragility as a life. The circumstances that could send the works of Keats and Baudelaire to join the works of Menander are no longer inconceivable. They're in the newspapers. So that's the opening of his first letter from Crisis of the Mind. And it speaks to what you're talking about, Stephen, that the more you study history, the more aware you become that not only is a solitary life fragile, so too is the life of a civilization. And that, cultures that want to survive and succeed in the long term are cultures that take that very seriously. Ours does not. We are a very history-phobic culture. For us, history is a hobby or something to spend your money on or spend your time on, but it's nothing that matters. And as a result, we find ourselves repeating old errors very frequently, almost as a matter of course. Indeed, that might be why we're so ahistorical, is to make it easy to repeat old errors when they secure short-term momentary advantage. So part of what Kenneth Smith is doing in this book is a very contra-modern thing, to say that we can't understand ourselves without looking back in history, particularly looking back far enough to see epochs whose view of the world was alien to our own, to be able to look at ourselves with alien eyes. This is a very, very non-modern thing to do, but maybe it's a good thing to do from the perspective of trying to salvage something that could go forward, even if the culture around us falls apart. So thank you for bringing up that quote. That's from chapter 3, which we'll get to anon. But you know, this whole book, even more than the previous book that we did together, Mythos and Logos, this book, Millennium Microcosm, really is an organism. And as you see, you can sort of dip in almost anywhere, and almost any sentence you pull out is relevant to wherever you happen to be focused in the book. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, your quote seemed to say more than that, though. It seemed to say that we cannot even live in a what I call with love in the ruins, because there will be no ruins. I mean, that is even more drastic, because, you know, in the Roman Empire there was ruin, and you could still have love in the ruins. I mean, like, so it seems more catastrophic than even that.
Yeah, you know, there's an orthodoxy in archaeology that civilization is only 10,000 years old, and that the oldest cities are only about 8,000 BC, nothing before that. And what's interesting is that's right around the time that the last of the glaciers were melting off from the previous glaciation. And you look at a map of the world and you see that during the height of the previous glaciation, the coastlines were far out to sea, and people like to build on coastlines. And so if you were trying to look for the evidence of cities older than 8,000 BCE, you shouldn't be looking at our modern coastlines. You should be looking out to where the coastlines used to be. But we haven't done that. We're only just starting to do that. For over a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, archaeology has been totally confident that the changes in the coastlines of the world have nothing to do with where we should be digging for archaeology. There's like this, there are 2 different silos of information, and different specialists specialize in one silo or the other silo, but not both. And the fact that it didn't make sense, that we were looking for older data in the wrong place, and then when we didn't find it, we then felt confident to assert, well, there was nothing older than that. It just underscores some of the incoherence of the modern order, the ways in which if you follow a system, it can exactly misprepare you to be able to understand what you're looking at. Now that there's beginning to be some exploration of underwater archaeology, now that they're starting to combine the disciplines, they're starting to find cities. There are, you know, villages, towns, and cities underwater around the world in various places. And you have to think that 100 years from now, an average school child's understanding of the depth of history will be significantly different from our own, because we have this enormous blind spot. So this question of where are the ruins that we would be able to, you know, be a part of, you know, one factor, of course, is just with time that they wear down and can be lost completely. But another is we can forget so profoundly that we don't even know where to look. And the ruins might still be there, and the information might still be there. There might still be things that we could learn from cultures that we don't even know existed, because we're just not.
So you can't give up on the legend of Atlantis.
Well, why does everybody have a flood myth? Maybe it's because when the ice melted, it flooded all of the coastlines around the world.
Whoever it was that came up with it, Solon, he's got another one, bagged another customer. Wonderful.
That's right. Let's see. Is it Douglas and then Richard? Was that the order? Go ahead, Douglas. You want to come off mute, though.
Okay. I would say my research is indicating there was an Atlantis. Okay. All right. I've done a lot of research on my philosophical. When you looked at Plato, and he talks about it. He's not just making things up, okay? There was an Atlantis, in my opinion, okay? And it's underwater, like you say, somewhat. So we have to look at these, okay? Now we're seeing things flying in the air that we can't even discuss what they are. So where we, with this whole thing, we better find out where we are before we, say we know too much, because we're finding that we know very little. Like Socrates said, people that understand that we know, we keep on learning over and over again.
Right. Yeah, there's a part of knowing ourselves enough to be, intelligent actors in the world. It requires knowing even the basics of our story. And an example of where that can mislead us is the orthodoxy and biological theories of evolution for about a century was based on the idea of gradualism, that the only source of genetic change in species was sort of a ticking clock of semi-random, semi-predictable mutations, and that they were always little mutations, and that they always added up over a smooth course of time to big changes. And the problem was the fossil record didn't exactly bear that out. And it wasn't until the 1970s with punctuated equilibrium that we finally had the evidence we needed to show that actually evolution goes faster and slower at different periods of time, depending upon the forces that are placed upon species. When they're well adapted, they don't evolve much. It's when they're maladapted, when circumstances change radically, that there is, rapid die-off and all the outliers that previously were not succeeding, when things were good, are now the best hope for success now that things are bad, because some of them might be weird enough to deal with the new weird circumstances. And so this kind of population of replacement where the bell curve collapses in the middle and the outliers become the new centers of bell curves is something that we just knew was not true for like 100 years. Until finally it was shown that actually, our past and our history and how we got here is a much messier affair, much more complicated. And it's the same way with the new discipline of underwater archaeology. We thought we had a nice, tidy story that went from about 8,000 BCE up to the present. We knew what order things happened in, when was agriculture discovered, when did we do cities, when did we do complex religions, and it made a nice story with a bow on top. And, the one thing that was wrong with it is it was based on too little information. And as we discover more information, we may find we don't have this nice, tidy little story of history. We might have something that involves greater catastrophes than we were previously ready for, or ready to acknowledge as part of the definition of who we are as a species. It's when you think about it, even if there was no underwater archaeology, even if the coastlines had not shifted, even if the story going back to 8,000 BCE, given by the orthodoxy, was more or less right, that's still only 10,000 years out of 200,000, 300,000. Who knows how old our species is. And yet with that tiny little sample size at the very end, we were confident saying this is the story of humanity. And, a great void that accounted for almost everything we ever did or were, that we just sort of wave our hands over and say, ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Nothing important must have happened then because there's nothing we know about then. It's weird how the modern mind works. Richard, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in regards to your underwater archaeology, there was at least one article in the BBC, and I think I've read it in several archaeological journals, that in northern Germany along the coast, there had been doing some dredging to increase the depth of shipping lines. And they were finding interesting artifacts, for want of a better term, in some of the dredge material. Right. And now there have been several explorations of the northern coast of Germany, along Denmark. I think they're even going down into France now, somewhere between the Channel, and finding material, and a significant amount of it, actually. And in regards to the comment about the Great Flood, I know that the gentleman who found, or the group that found the Titanic, had also gone into the Black Sea and did some exploration down there, and realized that, well, it's known that the Black Sea was once a closed sea, that the Bosphorus had actually been closed. It's not that wide, actually. and they were finding areas where it was known that there had been a beach. They can tell by the roughness of the pebbles and distribution of small rocks and sand. And they were also finding along their remains of housing.
Yes.
Let's say, the remains of posts and so forth. So they hypothesized, and it seems to make sense to a lot of people, that there were people camped all around the Black Sea using it as a resource. Bosphorus opens up, starts flooding. Now, the area there is not that steeply sloped, so the flooding was slow enough for people to move out. But if you're surrounding something and you move out, you're going to move out in all directions.
That's right.
And you get this lovely story of a flood that comes from there.
Yes. Yes. An exodus, losing the promised land, right? Because losing the promised land, you start out in an Eden, that's a beautiful place, and you lose it for one reason or another. A classic example is Doggerland, which I put a link to in the chat, which is the North, basically what's under the North Sea. Almost the entirety of the North Sea was above water during the height of the glaciation. You can look at the maps that archaeologists have, and it was a long process of thousands of years as the glaciers melted, by which Doggerland gradually was reduced until it was an island or a group of islands, and then gradually it was reduced until now it's shallows, where fishermen like to fish because it's close under the water, and a lot of fish like to gather there. But when they do trawlers through there, they pull up stone implements. There were Stone Age civilizations living there. And we just really have no idea. Same is true of the sea between Korea and China. All of that was above water. It's just a massive amount of land. I've spoken in previous sessions about how when we look at a language isolate like Korean and we can't relate it to any other language, maybe the reason is that all the related languages are underwater. They were right there in that zone that's now been flooded under. So we look all over the world and we find, there's some places where the mountains drop off sharply into the sea, and there the coastline didn't change much. But any place where there was a kind of a smooth, gradual continental shelf, that stuff used to be above water. So the point is, it's weird the level of confidence moderns are encouraged to have. On the one hand, we believe that we're the most objective and scientific civilization of all time, and that we are evidence-based. But on the other, we put so much pride in how certain we are that we know better than anybody else does, that we often confuse the evidence of absence and absence of evidence. We start to think that we have the whole picture or enough of the picture to make up our own mind and make decisions, when actually, like any civilization in any period of history, we have enormous gaps, and we ought to respect them, and we ought to hold our opinions cautiously, and we ought to hold our self-esteem as a civilization cautiously, recognizing that we are missing enormous parts of the picture. But we don't, because we aren't really who we think we are. We're a different civilization than the one that we think we are. So that's where this exercise of Millennia and Microcosm is useful, to look at these different perspectives on the world, and see how they saw things differently. We're going to start this week with the ancient perspective. Now, the book itself has a number of chapters on the ancient epoch, a number of chapters on the medieval, a number of chapters on the modern. But before that, it has 4 introductory chapters. We already did the first one. We're in the second one now, which gives an overview of the entire rest of the book. And then there's going to be 2 more introductory chapters. This overview gives us sort of a quick glance of this schema of 3 epochs of civilization. And, he's not asserting there haven't been more. He's just saying we don't have written records for most of whatever it is that humanity got up to for most of its hundreds of thousands of years. We just don't know. But this is what we know about, at least, from the European perspective. And the European perspective becomes important because during the modern epoch, Europeans, went all over the world and colonized all over the world and really shaped world culture.
It seems relatively certain that he understands the mindset of, say, the classical Greek. I'm not entirely sure myself, but this this tendency, there are various scholars, and they somehow they believe that they can stand in that mindset or they can observe it.
Right. Right. And the first hazard of trying to do that is the failure to understand that in any epoch, they're not static, they're dynamic, they're unfolding new order. And so, you see among the Greeks the tension between the archaic mythos-based worldview that they're losing, but that they're still writing about, and the new logos worldview that they're moving towards and embracing, and that's setting them up without realizing it for the revolution that's going to lead to the medieval epoch. And so anytime somebody says, well, I'm going to put you right into the perspective of the ancient worldview, the question has to be, well, which one? Right? Where in that, transition, where in the great diversity of that period are you claiming?
The thing is, I wonder how well that ancient concept is understood. Even Kenneth Smith might think is understanding it.
Yeah. He's only trying to show us a piece of it, the piece that we have access to. And of course, there's going to be more. They're going to be more alien than that. But the exercise is interesting because even if you just learn to see with the piece of the ancient worldview that they documented for us, that we know about, it shows us an entirely different world than the world we look at with our modern educated eyes. And that's kind of what we're going to start talking about here today. Phil, go ahead, and then I'll dive in.
Yeah, but even forgetting about the disappearing shorelines in the sunken sea and all that stuff, we have also destroyed what civilization there is by our colonialization.
Yes.
As an example, I mean, apparently anthropology says the Australian Aborigines have the oldest living culture.
Yes.
Supposedly maybe 50,000 years old, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, they have reduced that, what the Aboriginals call the dream time, what I would call the deep time, into essentially nothing. So we have no longer really any true access to what that dream time might be. And I presume that dream time is in some loose way connected to Carl Jung's collective unconscious. But
yes.
we have no idea, because they have been decimated, by the Aussies. I mean, I'm not accusing the Aussies, but just Western civilization, much like the American Indian and Native, education camps, which to me sounds very much like the Chinese education camps.
Yes.
I mean, like, and we condemn that. And they're just trying to create a unified culture. And of course, we did that very successfully, and we don't want to admit that's the same crime that we are accusing them of. So, so please don't think of me as, waving the flag of the Chinese.
Sure.
In the sense of like honoring their accomplishments. I'm just saying that we have done the same thing, perhaps even more horrendously than they have.
Actually, there's something there that's been obscured, and that's politically obscured today very much. And that is, it was a common understanding that the immigrants to Australia in very ancient times, when the current Aborigines claim 60,000 years of culture or something like that. From what I recollect, the stuff I saw when I was a kid was the belief that there were several waves of invaders into Australia. And if you went back, say, 40,000 years, you would find a race and a culture which was not that of the present Aboriginal one. The Aboriginals was believed years ago, well, as we conceive of them today, were later invaders.
Right.
That themselves overcame the culture they came across.
Yeah, there's an interesting phenomena the Navajo talk about where they say to be an old living culture is not to be a museum replica kept in a vacuum, but instead it's to be like a tree that grows and changes. And so, there is a fallacy we slip into that Stephen's putting his finger on here very nicely, thank you, where we look at a modern indigenous culture and we think that it is a living fossil or a time capsule. And it's not at all. There's an argument about this by Stephen Jay Gould in Biological Evolution, where he tries to stop the practice of referring to old species as being living fossils. He says there's no such thing as a living fossil. He says you get a species like the chambered nautilus that has been around for a very long time, nautilus, and it is every bit as modern as Homo sapiens is. All species are equally modern. They're all living in the modern world. They're all adapting to the modern world. And they have all, whether through a process of being extremely well fit, like the coelacanth is to its environment, or being very poorly fit and having to evolve rapidly like Homo sapiens did, either way, they're arriving at some kind of equilibrium with their current circumstances. And so as a result, if we look at something like, 40,000 years of Aboriginal culture in Australia, we're not seeing in Aboriginal culture today, or even before the arrival of Europeans, we're not seeing the culture that was there 40,000 years ago, because it evolved for 40,000 years and changed, sometimes for internal growth reasons, and sometimes because of new waves of people coming in, like Stephen points out. It's a very interesting subject. Let's see, is it Richard and then Phil? Was that the order?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I won't talk about 40,000 years, but maybe 400 years.
Yeah.
I will talk about people and not just coelacanths or animals like that. I do a lot of walking in Spain. I do a lot of the caminos. And my first year in 2011 walking, I took like 3,000 photographs. And there were a lot of times where I'd pick up my camera and I'd look through and oh, damn, that ruins a Kodak moment. There was a trash dumpster in front of a church, or there were a lot of telephone lines, and they ruined this really scenic view. And then after a while, I had the realization, oh, there are actually people living there. That
Right.
trash dumpster is in front of the church because it's a convenient place to have a trash dumpster.
Right.
Those lines are there, telephone lines or electrical lines, because they have telephones and electricity. People live there. I'm trying to put the place into amber, trying to visualize it as it was 400 years ago. It's like, no, it's a living place. People are still wandering around there and living their lives. So we have to keep that in mind. It's the same as the EU has a program to save dying languages. And I know there's some other places that have that as well. I know Phil mentioned some Indians at UC Berkeley who had come in to learn basket weaving. I also know that they teach them the rudiments of their language. But those people have moved on. They've learned English because it's more profitable for them, and so trying to get people to speak Occitan or one of the even more obscure languages in France is like, why are we going to do this? It's good for historians, it's good for researchers, but for the average person, no, it's no longer a living language, and there's a reason why it's no longer a living language.
Thank you, Richard. Phil, go ahead, and then Douglas.
Yeah, I need to disagree with that to a certain degree, because these Indians came in and they want to be reconnected to the original culture. So that's different than, let's say, forcing them in and you will learn your original language. So that's quite different. The other thing is, yes, depending how the intervention is. For instance, I myself love Japanese bonsais. I think they're beautiful. But that is not nature, not by any means.
Right.
We have transformed that into a dual representation of nature that has nothing to do with the way the trees are grown. If you cut off the roots and transform it into a midget miniature,
Yes.
That is not nature, evolving. It's
Right.
just turning into a museum piece. Same thing as like, American Indians making kachina dolls as collector's items now, rather than what they were originally for. So there's a difference between how it evolved and how they're forced to be evolved, either through the economy or through the larger culture, and separated by trimming off the roots to control its growth in some way. I mean,
Mhm.
so you have to understand that's a very delicate balance. You can't just say, well, yeah, but they're evolving, they're surviving, they're learning English is much more efficient to adapt to the new culture. Yes, that's true, but they also want to be reconnected to the culture. They evolve through the culture rather than being transplanted.
Thank you, Phil. Douglas, and then I'll take us to kind of what I have in mind for today. Go ahead, Douglas. You got to come off mute, though.
I guess that from a anthropological viewpoint, we find a civilization in heaven, different rooms that have no idea who we are, and that we're going to Christianize them and teach them the new techniques. And maybe they're happier, and maybe the way they live is much better than the way we live. But because we have arms and we're in charge here type of thing, and we're going, so we got to look at it from that standpoint as well. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's part of what complicates the subject is when is change the results of intrinsic natural development? When is change the results of sort of productive interaction between new cultures meeting older cultures? And when is change coercive and driven by a genocidal impulse to eliminate all cultures except the one true culture that we have our allegiance to? These are three completely different kinds of change. One of the things that moderns do is equate them all and say they're the same thing. So, if I kill somebody, I call it evolution and say I must have been more fit because I killed him. And it's a mistake. It's a mistake in several ways. One of the ways is, of course, it's an attempt to erase distinctions that are important for understanding the world. But the other reason it's a mistake is that, what do I want to say about this? What it is doing is presenting something that was a voluntary act of will as though it were the pattern of the cosmos. When we talk about the way that moderns deify humanity and deify ego and will and claim that nature has no authority over us, God has no authority of us, we're the top of the pyramid, and anything that we say it carries the weight of nature. It carries the weight of God. We say, if I hold you up at gunpoint, that's God wants you to give you the divine forces and sacred forces of the universe want me to have your money. Nature, survival of the fittest wants me to have your money. And in all of this, there is a strong element of metaphorical distortion where we take something that has a very specific localized meaning, we turn it into a sign, and then we stamp it out on other places where it doesn't belong. Biological evolution, for example, is a very specific phenomenon, but we use the metaphor of evolution on everything. We use the metaphor of evolution for if I change my software and it's better now, I say it evolved. Well, it didn't evolve. It's not a living species in an ecosystem. And furthermore, even if it were an individual in an ecosystem, in biological evolution, individuals don't evolve. Evolution is what a species does, not an individual. We warp these terms not because we are trying to get closer to the truth, but because we're trying to drape ourselves in the mantle of authority that we borrow from nature or from God to make our own ego choices seem as though they're destiny itself. And you better believe the Nazis and Stalin and Mao and anybody else who led to the deaths of tens of millions of people cloaked themselves in the language of God and nature in order to make their efforts seem like they were predestined. Holding people accountable is a funny thing to do, especially in the modern order when we work so hard to squirm out of responsibility for our choices and make them seem like they were inevitable. So in order to understand part of what I thought I would do this week is hit on that term physiocratic right in the first sentence when he's introducing the ancient worldview. When he says it's naturalist, he says it's physiocratic. And last week I said, Sharon's description of the physiocratic economic system is an example of somebody borrowing the term physiocratic and trying to figure out what that could mean in economic terms. But it doesn't tell us what Kenneth Smith meant by it, or what the concept is to the Greeks. So I thought, before we get much further, it might be useful to look a little closer at this. And part of the way to do this is with a reading list. like we need more things to read, right? But that's the point of Kenneth Smith's writing style, is that he's constantly pulling in the entire bodies of work of other philosophers and scientists and artists in order to try to illuminate what he's talking about. So I've gone through his lifetime reading recommended list. I've gone through discussions he and I've had, and I picked out a couple of titles I thought it would be useful for people to look at to try to get some understanding of what he's talking about here. So there is, let's see if I can find the right one here. There is a book by Hans Jonas called The Phenomenon of Life Toward a Philosophical Biology. Let me just paste that in the chat. He cites this one all the time, this book. And it's an attempt to work out the philosophical implications of biology. So moderns have a tendency to build their philosophies out of mathematics and logic, which leads to a very noetic view of the world. And as a counterbalance against that, to try to understand what a gnosic perspective on the world would be, it's hard to do, because gnosis is especially in its naive form, it's a pre-linguistic experience of the world. And even in its mature form, it's characterized by by trying to talk about aspects of the world that are very hard to put into words. Whereas mathematical and logical and similarly derived physics-based, chemistry-based models and philosophies are really easy to put into words. For all that we complain about quantum physics being hard to describe, we have equations. It's so easy to describe, we can actually lay out an equation for it. You totally can't do that with gnosis. So one of the ways to get at this is to say, what does philosophy look like if you take it out of the realm of math and logic and physics and chemistry, and instead stick it into the realm of biology and ecology and these complex subjects where the levels of complexity are orders of magnitude greater than what we're able to represent with the equations of physics or chemistry. Hans Jonas takes a stab at that in The Phenomenon of Life. There are some very good essays in there that talk about kind of what the world would look like from a biological perspective. The reason that that's important is that the modern perspective on the cosmos, despite the fact that we've had the revolutions of relativity and the revolutions of quantum physics, we still treat those as special cases that are extensions of Newtonian physics. We still prefer the Cartesian Newtonian time being, linear and stable, space being linear and stable, everything being divisible into units. Everything adds up and makes perfect sense and is stable. Almost every modern's perspective on the world is effectively pre-relativistic and pre-quantum, because we don't like it when time and space get squishy. It doesn't fit with the modern perspective on the cosmos, and so we sort of compartmentalize our brains if we become physicists, and we shift modes between our everyday life. And when we're called upon to be a quantum mechanic, then sure, we'll go do the equations and we'll produce the answers we're supposed to. But then when we get in our car to drive home, we put all that back in the box and go right back to a Newtonian Cartesian perspective on the world. So moderns really see the world as a math/logic/physics-based structure. And that's to us what the word nature means. We say the body's a machine. We say food is fuel, or everything is a mechanical metaphor. But that's not how the Greeks saw the world, right down to their word for nature, phusis, which means flowing or becoming. They have this concept of transformation and growth and change built right in from the ground up. They have what Kenneth Smith's going to argue in this part of this chapter and in the rest of the book, is that they do have a biological metaphor for the world. To them, instead of life being an odd special case and rocks being the normal case. For the Greeks, biology is the normal case. Everything is alive. Even a rock has its own minimal level of life. And what we discover when we immerse ourselves in a physiocratic perspective is that it is no less valid than a mathematical, logical, physics-based model of the world. They're both ultimately metaphors, choosing one level of organization as being what we translate everything else into. And it turns out there are a lot of things that you can see more clearly from a biological perspective than from a mathematical perspective. Hans Jonas helps us to see some of that. He writes for a modern audience and tries to do an active translation for us. Donald, go ahead, you got your hand up.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt your talking, but Hans Jonas' book is very good, but it's also old.
It's old.
It is old. I read it as a mere boy. No, as one of Kenneth's students, probably. But even there's an appendix to it where Jonas says, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in our understanding of genetics and DNA
Right.
that he did not have time to incorporate.
Right.
And I just want to caution people that this is truly a good book, but there's been a lot of work in biology, critical work, since it was written.
Right.
Might be somebody take that up. I don't know that anyone has, but it is a marvelous book.
Yeah, I second that caution, and I happen to have a few recommendations to bring it more up to date. So hang on a second, I got to tell my brother I'm in my philosophy seminar. All right, so the title, The Phenomenon of Life, makes a nice jumping off point for my second recommendation. I'm actually going to recommend two books by Christopher Alexander, The Phenomenon of Life, same title, and The Process of Creating Life. I have them right here. In fact, open on my lap right now. They're part of a 4-volume series called The Nature of Order. And they're big books, and they are packed with photos and diagrams. They're heavy books. They're on magazine print to be able to support the enormous number of pictures. And he needs this enormous number of pictures because he's going to try to illustrate the things that Hans Jonas was talking about. And he's going to take it to another level beyond Hans Jonas. He's in The Phenomenon of Life. He's going to try to describe life itself geometrically as terms of the kinds of shapes that it creates and what that does in the world. And then in the process of creating life, he's going to try to talk about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit that Hegel talks about. He's going to try to talk about how does life get created, and he's going to distinguish that from the way that modernism typically creates things. So, a little reference for those of you who don't have these books handy or aren't really prepared to grab them. A summary of the 15 properties, the geometric properties of nature, is on this website I'm linking to right there in the chat, and you can click on that. And there are some. He goes through this blogger goes through the 15 properties described in the book, The Phenomenon of Life, and he shows you just a couple of photos or pictures for each property. The book doesn't have any of these photos. This blogger collected some that he thought represented it, and it's a much smaller number per idea, which makes it a little harder to grok what's being said. But the idea is that life is not an exception. Life is not oh, well, there's that weird thing. Yeah, sorry, I said grok a lot. That life is a very specific principle in the world that, because of how specific it is, it generates a halo of side effects that you can see everywhere it goes. And that the definition of life that limits it to biological life so constrains the definition of life that we're unable to explain where it came from or what it is. But if we broaden the definition to a geometric definition instead of a cellular definition, then we can see how a river has a kind of life and a living structure. There's a reason why the branching of rivers corresponds to the branching of trees, corresponds to the branching of neurons. They're trying to solve spatial problems. And they're solving those spatial problems because the forces at work are in conflict with one another, like Heraclitus talks about, in a very specific way that forces them into converging upon patterns of solutions. He says it's the same thing for why are river deltas so have such complex structures. Just like the boundaries of an amoeba, as it moves, extends pseudopods and ends up with this, bays and inlets and peninsulas of a boundary between itself and others. There's a reason why we see that kind of a complicated, crinkly interface between living systems and the environment around them, not just there, but everywhere, because that's a geometric way of solving a geometric problem that resolves some forces that they're put under. So it's a really different way. It actually hurts a little bit to get out of the ruts that we've been in lifelong for how we define life, and to be able to even consider the idea that there's a geometry to life, and not a specific stamped out Xerox geometry, but rather there are patterns to how life has to solve its problems that cause it to recreate these shapes over and over and over in different contexts. It's really an interesting argument. And the fact that he makes the argument not using math or logic, but using pictures and descriptions of what you're seeing in the pictures. He's appealing to your gnosis, to your subjective experience of the world, and saying, you recognize this, right? You've seen this, you've experienced this. And modernism told you to ignore it and said, that's not important. That's just noise. But what if it isn't noise? What if your gnosis is reliable? What if your gnosis is telling you things that you need to know? And it's a weird experience to have an argument that's so important being brought down to the level of gnosis instead of to the logic of noesis that we're accustomed to in the modern order. But the process of doing it is a very useful one for breaking free of the shackles we're in, just for a little bit, to sort of get a taste of what it would have been like to be Greek, right? Like, an ancient Greek didn't worship Poseidon because a book told him to. He worshiped Poseidon because the Greeks depended upon the ocean, and the ocean is fickle and the ocean is dangerous. And you didn't need to be told to have faith in the ocean. The dangerousness of the ocean was right in your face. The experience of the ocean was the source of religion, rather than a denial of experience and an insistence on orthodoxy. It's an inverted form of religion.
Okay, Rick, you're talking about all these views as if they have some sort of objective truth. To me, they're all just victims of their own particular set of delusions. Sorry.
Well, the question is gnosis a stupid mistake of history, just an accident, just random that it's there? Or did evolution develop gnosis in us for a reason? Is gnosis actually an essential and useful feature of a biological organism? And in the modern world, we say, well, it's just that stupid subjective stuff. Maybe it was useful when we were stupid and primitive, but now we should ignore it. But the argument from nature says, well, the heart's important, and the lungs are important, and the hand is important. Nature is somewhat conservative in what it invests in, and it's invested an entire half of our brain in gnosis. It could be that gnosis is important too. Anyway, Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I wonder whether that isn't a problem with mind itself. I mean, I think mind, whether that originally was the case or whether it developed into that case, the mind kind of wanted to have control.
Yes.
And if you live in a structure of sensations and experiences, it seems like it's always ever slipping into another dimension. Yes. And I actually think that, like I said from the beginning, the splitting the stone and having it work created a technology, and a technology that eventually evolved into the mind, that it works this method works, you know, and I go back to the myth of Osiris and Seth. You know, Osiris, the god of life, the god gave life to the world, and
Yes.
it was Seth who understood measurements and cut him up and reduce him to the god of death with the book of the dead, and is in fact buried in the tomb, the grand tomb of measurements that Seth created. I mean, like, it's just like I said, score one for Seth
Right.
and civilization in general, because it produces a structure that could repeat itself, and it seems to expand, and it seems to be making everything better because we have control over it. And I wonder whether that addiction has gotten to this point that we can't get away from it, because it's become not only habitual, but it's actually structured in our mind itself. You know, that in a sense, it's more than just say giving up your addiction. It's like, no, that is the mind. As I said, you know, when I created my own blind spot experiment, the mind tells me that the way it is, the way it ought to be, rather than the way it is, because I am not going to believe it, because I want it to be whole and unified and uniform. And so therefore, and I know it lies to me, and I continue to accept it that it lies to me, because otherwise I'm going crazy, because I'm used to it. So I just wonder whether we can ever actually lose control that we think we have, that we might not have, but nonetheless, you know, we think we have it.
Well, you know, and it's part of what this exercise is about, is not, the argument is not that if we learn to see things as closely as we can to how the ancient Greeks saw things, that will be the right perspective on the world and we should abandon everything we know. This is not an argument for orthodoxy. This is an argument for getting comfortable holding multiple independent lens systems in our mind and being able to shift between them. Yeah, because the premise is that if we stay stuck in a single lens system, then we will lifelong be heir to the same set of distortions that it introduces, and we'll never get to look in our blind spots. They'll be there forever. It's only by being able to move back and forth between different worldviews that we can look into those blind spots and even know that we have blind spots. And it's not until you see an optical illusion and you realize how fooled you were that you fully believe in optical illusions. I mean, we all remember more or less what it's like the first time when you get the line with the two ends that are like this, and the other line with the ends like this. And you know, looking at it, you know this one is longer and this one is shorter. And then you get the ruler out and you're like, damn it, why is the ruler saying they're the same length when I know they're not? I know they're not. And it's your, you know, it starts to crack that certainty that needs to be cracked so that we can hatch.
Yeah, but I pointed at least to the decisive moment of that change. You know, like as Cézanne was moving in a system in which he was trying to create forms, but he was finding in nature, right?
Right.
And he left the blank spot because he couldn't decide how to put it, what the color was and all that. So it's not about being a nothingness. But Picasso, after Picasso, it became a system. Although he was trying to liberate and transform the language, nonetheless, I said finding was within the structure of making. Mm-hmm. That's very different kind of finding, because finding is already in the system. And no wonder it finally found itself in a relatively short time to Mondrian, right? Because we found out the pure mathematics of what that is. I mean, so once again, it's not that I don't like Picasso because he is a hero, but it just sort of quickly fell back to the structure of finding within the structure itself, right?
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to call on Douglas and then Stephen. Let's see what people
I would say it this way. Jerome Baranowski, maybe I pronounced his name wrong, just correct me if I did, said that mathematics is the closest thing to consciousness. Now, in my writings, I say we are mathematical concepts. Then we can explain, what we are through mathematics. I haven't looked at it that way, but this is a really important way to look at civilization through mathematics.
Yeah, it's natural for a modern to look at the world through mathematics because mathematics matches well with noesis. Noesis loves mathematics. And so, the modern perspective likes to mathematize everything. And the idea that, my dad's a math major. I grew up with math. Math is my, one of my native languages. But the problem with it is that it's a reductionist approach. It's arguing that there's only one perspective you need. And if you get that one perspective, you can see everything. That kind of monism has been a problem with Western civilization going all the way back to the medieval revolution and even to its precursors in Parmenides and Plato, who are saying that there is an unchanging world of truths. And if you could see that unchanging world of truths, you would know everything that matters. And in doing that, they were rejecting the complexities of the world. They're also rejecting the paradoxes that are created by having a mortal perspective, a finite perspective on what's actually an infinite cosmos. We're still stuck in that same appeal. We say, if we could just translate everything into noesis, we would see everything the way it truly is. But the best information we have from the scientists who do the most interdisciplinary work and who push the boundaries the most is that nature doesn't have just one language. Math is one of the languages of nature, but physics is a separate language of nature, despite the fact that you can use so much math in it. It is a separate language of nature because when things accumulate to the level in complexity to the level of physics, new order, new laws of nature emerge at that level of complexity that were not even hinted at when we were down at the mathematical level. The same thing happens with chemistry. When the physics gets complex enough that we're dealing with the realm of chemistry, the cosmos unfolds new natural laws that were not hinted at the level of physics. That if you try to reduce everything to physics, you can't actually do chemistry effectively. And we don't know how many layers there are like this, but biology is like a whole pile of layers. From biochemistry up through cellular biology, up through all kinds of things. And at each of these levels in biology, again, new natural laws emerge at the right level of complexity that you can't see at the level below. So when people tell me that math is the language of the cosmos, I'm like, I can agree with that if you say that math is a language of the cosmos, but the cosmos is a polyglot. It's multilingual. And to fully understand it, well, first of all, we never can because we're mortals, we're finite, or we'll die first. We won't get there. But to get closer to understanding it, it helps if we speak more than one of its native languages, so that we can start to see things from the different angles, to break free of the shackles of the finite perspective. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Another quote. He's spends a lot of time bashing the modern world,
Sure.
and here he's accused him, but modernity is intellectually and morally corrupt from an extrinsic way of understanding.
Right.
There's a lot of accusation there, isn't there? It's
what's interesting
intellectually
about it,
and morally corrupt.
Yes. He says that what he's saying here is that the extrinsic focus of modernity hides all the most difficult philosophical questions of epistemology, just brushes them away as though they're nothing. It's like, how do we know you brought this up in a previous week. How do we know we're seeing things the way they actually are? Why do we have that confidence that we see, not through a glass darkly, but with, you know, virtually the eyes of God, we see the cosmos the way it is. Why do we think that? What gives us the basis for that for that confidence? And what Nietzsche and others conclude when you dig deep into the structure of modernist epistemology is that the entire basis for that confidence is the confidence itself. It's a circular argument. The whole reason that we think we see it accurately is because we decided a priori as our identity that we're born into, like as though it is a natural right. We think we inherently see it right. And if you actually dig into the structure of how we see things and how we know things and how we conclude, you know, what's morally right and wrong, it's all full of these little finitizing, infantilizing circles that prevent us from asking any of the important questions. And so there's this interesting way in which, you know, Kenneth Smith, he's not saying that modernism is the worst epoch that ever existed or the worst kind of civilization that ever existed or anything. All he's saying is we hate being criticized so much that even if you say one obviously true thing about us that isn't flattering, we lose our minds. We say, oh yeah, you're a utopian. Why suppose you wish you lived in a cave with rocks? You're just an obscurantist. You're just a hater. We like have this massive we just erupt on people. And it's interesting because
we have indoor plumbing.
Right, indoor plumbing. That's what we say. What, you don't want a flush toilet? We like our immediate response is, well, then you don't get anything. Go live in a cave. And what's funny about that is that in most of life, we understand that you can criticize something without condemning it to hell, right? That you can say this has problems without saying, and therefore we should nuke it from orbit, right? But modernism itself as an epoch can't stand to have the criticisms that it dishes out to other things applied back to it.
So I was saying before, real quickly, because it came to me, is pi. Take pi, for instance, in the mathematical formula.
Sure.
That's going to keep going on and on and on. It means that we don't know anything, because it's going to go on and on. That's mathematics. So I look at it, you know, one of the things, okay, I'm looking at some math there, and I'm looking at the word pi.
Right.
So,
right. So we use base 10 because we've got the 10 fingers, but you got to ask the question, is it just the convenience of the 10 fingers? Like, have we chosen badly? Should we not be using base 10? Should we be using base pi? Would the world make more sense if pi was taken as the base? Because then pi wouldn't be infinite. It would be the unit of 1. And it would be other values that would be infinite or have long decimals. And maybe if we did that inversion, a whole bunch of things that are confusing to us now would make more sense. But some of the things that seem to make sense to us now would be confusing. So yeah, there's this way in which we don't really want to be criticized. So the project he's engaged in this book of saying, let's lift up the ancient and medieval perspectives and give them as much respect as we give the modern one, at least long enough to find out what they have to say about modernism and the world. And, you know, the moment you say that, you're going to lose something like 90% of your audience who they can't let go of the faith that we're the pinnacle of history and that nothing could be better than us. And that any attempt to do otherwise, it goes beyond a thought exercise. I mean, of all the thought exercises people are willing to do of absurd and ridiculous things, they don't want to do this one because it's too close to blasphemy, which shows the level at which it is a fundamentally irrational religious conviction and not a logically, epistemologically arrived at conclusion.
Well, it's the shock of the Greek. He thinks he's the greatest thing out, goes to Egypt, goes down the Nile, sees the Sphinx and the pyramids. And
yes.
I can't top that.
Yes.
Damn it. I want to kill them all, destroy it all. I want my beautiful vision of the Greeks as the greatest things in the universe back again.
Yes.
Or I'm depressed. I'm going to give up.
Yes. Yes. You know, it's a funny thing because we have this picture of the Greeks in our minds and they play a role for us as moderns. We call ourselves the heirs to the Greeks. And we try to denigrate all the other sources of possible information, which is ironic because Thales and others went to Egypt to study. They went to Mesopotamia to study. They knew there were older cultures that had other information, and they brought it back to Greece and they used it to their advantage philosophically, scientifically, economically. But in our pop culture retelling of the Greeks, we don't want that to have happened. We want the Greeks to be a miracle that erupted out of nowhere, and we're tied to that miracle, and so therefore we're miraculous too. There's like this weird low level, almost superstition level connection that we have to our abstract version of the Greeks. And we start reading about the Greeks adding to their religion every time they find a new religion for a new culture that has a god that they don't know about, and it makes us squirm because it doesn't fit with the clean, perfect, pristine, crystalline, no changes needed version of the Greeks, right? They have more of an organic, growing, approach that we ourselves have turned away from. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think I told this story before, but it's interesting to repeat it again. It was very important, at least to my understanding. About 3 weeks ago, I was in I guess a lecture on Hegel, and he talked about Hegel's, I guess, development of this sort of inner reflection of the outer world and all that. But the punchline really came from the fact that, in a sense, because this sort of kind of intellectual, metaphysical understanding, Western civilization has developed, in a sense, not only the past and future in our language structure, but the past and the future perfect, which is, in a sense, something that haven't happened yet or didn't happen, but there's a possibility of it happening, okay, of that sort. So very sophisticated language to express not only what will happen, but what ought to or might not happen, that ought to happen. So it's a very complex thing. And I think this was put in the context of this Japanese physicist. I guess somebody asked him, and this physicist was a Nobel Prize winner in the 1920s at the time of, quantum theory, quantum physics. And they asked him, like, how could you possibly understand quantum physics when your language cannot even describe possibilities?
Right,
okay.
Right.
And he says, well, because we have not been corrupted by Aristotle. Right? We're not trapped in this language structure, and we understand it. And it's you who had problem understanding it, because that's why you can't believe in Niels Bohr.
Right.
Because you did not understand it, and you're now asking us, why don't we understand it? I mean, I thought that was an incredible insight. We had not been corrupted by Aristotle. So
yes,
I think that's worth saying, because that's a direct criticism of this metaphysics of logic.
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at what the medieval scholastics and other scholars did to Aristotle, because he himself considered himself to be an explorer. He was documenting all the things that he came across and trying to think about everything. And he wanted to do better tomorrow than he did yesterday. But by the time the medievals got a hold of him, he became part of the logical and ideological justification for the medieval version of religion. And in that role, they could not allow Aristotle to be who he actually was. He needed to be a firm, unchanging pillar, a pedestal on which they could set the rest of their theology. And so they did things to Aristotle that must have had him spinning in the grave just as much as what the Nazis did to Nietzsche. It's like, this is not me. What the hell? Why are you putting this in my mouth? Yeah, I did a book on logic, but if you looked at my book on comedy, oh no, they burned that one because they didn't want that. It's like the whole picture of the person is, comes out as somebody quite different from what they did to him. But, it's not a coincidence that the book on comedy might be burned, but the book on, truth versus falseness, the binary dichotomy with the excluded middle, that they preserved, because that gave them the absolutism that they needed for their apocalyptic version of Christianity, which was again very different from what we have today, and from how it started out. Donald and then Douglas. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, I was going to say something quickly about Hans Jonas, that in the Heraclitean
Yes.
universe of constant change, he takes up the problem of, without memory, there can't be consciousness. But how can there be memory if it's a new river every time, you know, and we're a new being every time? Sort of. This is also, I see this. I've been trying to still read this Henri Bergson's Metaphysics, you know, where it's a whole new world, moment to moment, whatever the time quanta is, but establishing this continuity, so life or organism, and that's I think another thing that Hans Jonas says, is that it wasn't species that came to being, it's life as a whole.
Yes.
With all its interdependencies is what appeared. No individual part today could live without the organic ecosystem.
Right.
So it must have been that ecosystem in some level of completeness that came about, because and the way life has transformed the physical world.
Yes.
To make it hospitable for what? Oh, life. It makes it hospitable for life.
Yes. Yes.
You know, because it's not naturally, and this is somewhat the modern physics, you know, has everything runs down, and life, while life decays, it grows, becomes, and then decays.
Yes.
Most physical processes don't do that, but life does. Life puts the pieces back together. It's the opposite of entropy.
Yes.
But he's trying to figure out how, in terms of human biology, these phenomena can be possible. You know, so it's pretty. It's far more relevant. This is one of the things I'm sitting here saying, oh, why? What's the thing with Bergson and Jonas and physiocratic and all this stuff? And I'm just thinking as people are talking, Kenneth tied a lot more things in here than I thought. And of course, you know, my thinking is at a different level than Kenneth's, but we should, I don't know, this organic view. And I equally, how the medievals, you know, Kenneth has often said, you know, I should be exposed to Aristotle more, but you know, I was disappointed that the medievals took the good from Plato and it became God, and then they took this system of knowledge from Aristotle and it sort of became God's creation, and they got it wrong both times.
Right.
I mean,
right, but because it was useful, right, to
Yeah.
the theology,
Yeah.
they cherry picked the things that seem to offer support.
I know it seems like every time someone finds out that I've read Plato over and over, I get all this Neoplatonist mysticism from whatever. And I'm going, God, where did that come from?
Yes.
I thought I'd read everything Plato had written. I
Yes.
haven't found that yet.
Yes.
You must be working from new text.
Let's just keep inserting more and more into Plato and calling it Plato, even though I wrote it. Right. Douglas and then Phil. Go ahead, Douglas.
Yeah, that's what gets me. We still don't know about mummies and how they do it, and they don't know a lot of things. But here's the thing. It was getting into Plato, which is my bullet work of Greek philosophy. Plato's, he said, Socrates said, the oracle asked him, why are you so smart? He said, well, you all go around telling people how much you know. I don't know anything. And I tell you today, we don't know. We keep on thinking we're knowing something, and then we just find something else that's new. What we know is so limited. Okay.
Right.
And maybe in 1,000 years, we'll find something that we didn't know, but exactly where this whole thing takes us. That's a big issue of it.
Yeah. It's always interesting with Socrates because you get a mix of, on the one hand, some very noetic foreshadowing of the sophists mixed in with archaic physiocratic wisdom. And he modulates back and forth without using a turn signal because he's Socrates. But it means that it's always rewarding. There's always a richness in there, the kinds of questions. This core idea of epistemology, that we have to begin by knowing that we know nothing, that what we think of as knowing, we should just put that on a shelf. It's like, that's not a very useful idea. It's like, he gives us so much that's good with just that beginning. It's marvelous. Phil, go ahead.
Well, my thought is that, can you blame the medievals for what they did to Aristotle or Plato, because they have chosen Seth? Seth, the technology of Seth. Seth was the first Mason. That sustained the medieval cathedrals and so forth, right? So in a sense, I was going to say, and I'll say it now, is like, I am now, I guess, studying with a group on being and time.
Yeah.
Heidegger is a very, very subtle thinker, no question about it. Very nuanced, very subtle, very just incredible. But when I think about it, I think ultimately he is a metaphysician, because I'm thinking about the title, because it should be being in time. Why is it being and time? Because man is an equal partner with time. He has a relationship with time which he could maneuver to a certain degree and respond to a certain degree. Being in time is where the beasts belong. You see what I'm saying? I think that's a very subtle difference. He is so careful about his words that why didn't he say being in time? Because that seems more correct. But he insists on calling it being and time, right? The being is in relationship to a struggle or whatever, a calling, whatever it is, between being, which only belongs to Dasein, by the way.
No, sorry.
Yeah.
Just saying hi to everybody.
Hi, Joseph. Welcome to the call.
So I think that subtle use of the word, I actually think he is a metaphysician, even though he's attacking it to a great degree. So so that's interesting. Yeah. As subtle as he is still a word person.
So for Joseph's benefit, what we're doing today is we're going into that word physiocratic that opens up the section on the ancient worldview in this chapter 2. We're trying to say, well, where do we look for inspiration to try to understand what is the physiocratic worldview? And part of that for us is looking at what does the cosmos look like if instead of being grounded in math and logic, what if it's grounded in biology, in life, a vision of a as Christopher Alexander says in book 3 of The Nature of Order, a vision of a living world. What do things look like then? And so we've been dropping references in the chats. We talked about Hans Jonas. We've talked about Christopher Alexander, the phenomena of life and the process of creating life. The phenomena of life is useful for getting a completely alien perspective on what counts as life. Christopher Alexander's definition will have you thinking sand dunes are a form of life. They may not be biological life, but there is a life to them, the way they preserve themselves in the tension of the wind and the gravity and the nature of sand, that they recreate themselves. Just like a river system, the hydrological system and the relationships between mountains and plains and oceans recreate rivers over and over and over. There is a more fundamental form of life that has to do with these geometries that are produced by the resolution of these forces that cause the solutions to converge on certain patterns. And that, Christopher Alexander's definition gives us a way to explain how cellular life arose. Because cellular life arose because all of this pre-biological life already existed on Earth. Earth already had all these other cycles that became the cradle within which it was possible for a cell to develop. A cell couldn't develop in the vacuum of space without any support systems. It can't just poof itself as a miracle out of nowhere, like some kind of quantum miracle. It needs the simpler life of sand dunes and rivers and clay deposits as the matrix that it's going to build its own, very simple cellular life out of. And we as multicellular organisms can't exist until single-celled organisms have populated the world and created a more complex matrix that we can use as our foundation. There is this way in which there's no such thing as a single living thing. It's always within a rich matrix of simpler life beneath us and more complex life above us. So this is one of the things that it's hard to find people who write about this. It's very, if we're trying to understand a physiocratic world, we find ourselves at a loss because almost all writers on biology are writing from the modernist perspective. They're writing from a noesis perspective, logic and math. They assume there's only one language to the cosmos. They want to reduce everything down to math or logic and please the noetic side of themselves. And they don't understand how doing that means that they are leaving behind the other languages that nature speaks, such as the many languages of biology. So Hans Jonas gives us some angle into that with his book, The Phenomena of Life. Christopher Alexander with his book, The Phenomenon of Life, gives us some perspective into that. I put a link to a site that has the 15 properties from his Phenomenon of Life, the geometric properties of life in nature. And it's not a complete example. The book goes into much more detail. The second volume of The Nature of Order, The Process of Creating Life, takes a Hegelian approach. This is where we talk about, why it is that life can't be the result of a designer sitting down at a drafting board and making life. It just can't happen that way. It only happens through the Hegelian process of unfolding. There has to already be form present, a matter present that suggests more sophisticated form that can be created from it. In the same way that an electron and a proton want to interact, they want to create the larger structure of an atom. It's intrinsic to their nature. They're not passive Legos waiting for an outsider to snap them together into a design. They have a primitive life of their own because of their electric charges and their mass and their other qualities that makes them want to interact and form larger relationships. And that intrinsic, not transcendental, not extrinsically imposed, but intrinsic, essential force and direction creates a vector in the world, and the intersection of those vectors results in the unfolding of larger structures of behavior. This is something that Hegel talks about it, but he talks about it in German, and it doesn't translate well into English. And even if it did, Hegel himself is somewhat abstruse as a thinker. It's very hard to get to the biological core of what Hegel's trying to tell us, even though it's what he means. And so when we look beyond Hegel for somebody else to talk about these things, what we keep finding is that they mostly don't. They mostly don't grapple with it at this level. They try to translate it into something else, and too much is lost. So it's part of what's interesting about Christopher Alexander's series, The Nature of Orders. It's one of the few places that somebody really tries to grapple with a biological perspective of the world. Now, as Hegel tells us in the History of Philosophy, he got all his good ideas about this from Heraclitus. Heraclitus is even harder to understand because all we have is these fragments. But Philip Wheelwright's translation of Heraclitus tries to preserve this biological perspective on the world. I shared a link to the Internet Archive. You can download PDF or other format. Philip Wheelwright's book is finally available for free. So grab yourself a copy. It's one of Kenneth Smith's go-to works. He's constantly referencing Heraclitus or Wheelwright's translation of it. And if you go back and forth between Hegel and Jonas and Alexander and Heraclitus, you sort of start to feel out the territory a little bit. But it seems to me, looking at this, that in philosophy, there is still a great gaping lacuna where somebody needs to sit down and write an introductory philosophical work that introduces a biological framework for epistemology, axiology, and ontology that basically sets up, some approximation of the ancient worldview by doing that. And of course, all that can do is, as Stephen pointed out earlier in this call, that can't give you the ancient worldview because that was complex and varied and caught up in historical dynamisms and all kinds of things. But it will be alien enough from the modern perspective to give us part of what we want out of reaching for the ancient worldview, which is a different, what's the word I'm looking for? The standpoints. The Greek philosopher with the lever. If I had a long enough lever, I could move the world.
Archimedes.
Archimedes.
Archimedean standpoint, enough to give us a different Archimedean standpoint that's alien to our own enough to be able to comment on our own and help us to escape the labyrinth of our own. So Joseph, you got your hand up, go ahead.
Are you going to post the Phil Wheelwright's Heraclitus book? I'd be interested in.
It's there in the chat. The
what
archive.org/details/Heraclitus. You see that link?
Archive.org. Okay, I see it.
Click on that, and then when you get there, scroll down a little, and you have a choice of formats to click on to download onto your computer.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure. Go ahead, Joseph.
So just really quickly, and I don't want to take us too far off track. So it's just basically looking at a return to nature from a non-modernist perspective. But I was just quick, and I'm just thinking of the ethics aspect of this.
Yeah.
From an ethics aspect of it, is there a distinguishing between sentient beings and non-sentient beings? And then I'm assuming that you're saying no in this framework, and meaning in as far as like how we should look at the importance of nature in and of itself. So, so as far as our value systems are concerned, that you wouldn't make. Yeah, I mean, because then it's kind of like that's where a lot of times where utilitarians kind of will often draw the line, and that is a modernist perspective.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's how would he address that? I hope
So
it's
the
not too far
idea
off topic.
of drawing the line is a very modernist thing to do because we worship the law of the excluded middle. We want things to be true or false, good or bad, important or not important. And of course, the truth of anything in the cosmos is more paradoxical than that. There's huge gray areas, and there's areas where things are not half as important, but rather are unimportant from some perspectives, but all important from others, and important in different ways from yet third perspectives. And we have a hard time with that because we want to create an ontological flatland in which everything is what it is and is not what it's not. And the world just refuses to be that simple. So if you look at indigenous cultures, if you look at the languages that they use and the grammar structure, you know how in Indo-European languages, we make a great deal out of gender. We gender every noun. And the reason for doing that is to give us a system of pronouns that allows us more shorthand than just saying the one thing that I referred to. We can now say, well, the male thing that I referred to, or the female thing I referred to. In Spanish or French or Italian, by having the two different pronouns, it means that we can now have shorthands for two different things in the conversation. And that's really the role that gender plays linguistically. So if you look at indigenous languages that are not Indo-European, what you discover is that they do things other than gender as their tricks for trying to have more shorthands and more pronouns in the language. And among the distinctions that they'll make is they will distinguish between animate versus inanimate things, and they'll frequently put rivers and wind in animate. And then they'll distinguish between plants and animals. They'll distinguish between things that have language and things that don't have language, or things that think and things that don't think. In Navajo, living things includes lightning. Interestingly enough, it falls into the people and lightning are in the same category with each other grammatically. And so what you see in these things is sort of a result of cultural evolution. And I'm misusing the word evolution, just like I said not to do about a half hour ago. You're seeing the result of a cultural adaptation to trying to answer the question that you're asking. If you have a physiocratic perspective on the cosmos and you develop a philosophy out of that, what's the result? And the result's going to be, partially, it's going to be tentatively held, because you're going to recognize that the human mind can't deposit absolute truth about the world. And it doesn't have to, as long as we don't worship the law of the excluded middle. We can hold our ideas with tentativeness, or as Phil says, we can stand at the city gate and look both ways, as long as we're not insisting that it's one or the other. But when you do these cross-cultural comparisons, you see that everybody's wrestling with that thing. And part of what they conclude is that, except for modern cultures, most cultures conclude that things don't have to be alive to matter. And things don't have to be intelligent to matter, that there's plenty of things without language or without a brain that have beauty, or that have a unconscious but important logic to them that makes the world go, and that we don't want to mess with, because we recognize that we're so fragile and that we're dependent upon these things that we don't fully understand. I know that doesn't give a simple answer, but
No, it's a very good answer, actually, because it talks about how everything's interrelated and that it's not an either or proposition. It's an actually it includes both. So and I appreciate that, because I think we do look at things as in terms of like the law of excluded middle, in the sense that we want this yes or no kind of logically based solution to ethical concerns. And it really is it's never that simple. And it's much more nuanced than that. And a return to nature is actually critical in this overall framework, is that's your starting point. It's not the point to be avoided, because there are a lot of people that actually believe that, even that we're adaptable, that and this adaptation can come via logic, science, and math, and it's actually much more complex than that. And so I can definitely, that resonates with me quite a bit, because I often think about returning to nature as far as for answers in a Taoist way of looking at the world. And I also look at human nature as well, and what that actually means. So that actually that was a very good explanation into answering my question, and not drawing that line, because I don't draw that line.
Right.
I think it's important not to, actually. But I know a lot of modernists do believe that. Anyway, that's just some thoughts. Thank you sorry for the late joining.
No problem. It's a great question. It's boy, it's a rich area. I'll call on Douglas in just a second, but if I'm trying to make a list of works that we can read or look at that are going to give us a physiocratic perspective on the world, or even just a glancingly physiocratic perspective on the world, to anything to help us get a feel of what it's like, what the ancient worldview must have been like, it's just shocking how little there is. Most works that want or claim to have done it upon closer inspection are still entirely noetic. They might have some hint or whiff of gnosis, and that itself might feel, on the one hand, revolutionary, and on the other hand, kind of out there whack job. It's like that, wow, you've gone way outside of noesis. And yet, when you look closer, you realize it's almost entirely a noetic work. They've only just sort of waved their hand in the general direction that's forbidden to us, and that we have all these hackles that rise up against it. So like James Lovelock's work, Gaia, he attempts to describe the world as a living organism, but the way that he describes it is as a living organism, like a big cell, or like like it's a big animal or a plant or something. And that's a really modernist way to try to understand the interconnectedness of the biosphere. It's modernist because it tries to make a thing out of it. And the thing is, the world is a life. It tries to, it's weirdly obedient to the law of the excluded middle, is what I want to say. And despite the fact that many of his examples are the right examples, the way that he spins them is he spins them for a modern noetic audience, because he himself is a modern. He's not centered in the physiocratic cosmos. He can't look at it the way an ancient would look at it. And it's part of why indigenous cultures all over the world look at that book Gaia and they're like, yeah, we've been saying this for a long time, but you wouldn't hear it when we said it. And furthermore, you're not saying it the way that we would say it either. It's not just like the world is a big animal or something. It's that the truth and the importance of the thing is not in its thingliness, but in between things, in the relationships and the transformations over time. That stuff that English is not good at. English is a very noun-centered language. And you look at some of these other languages like Basque or Navajo, and they're very verb-centered languages. Everything is talking about processes of unfolding and becoming, and that's the natural state of a sentence in those languages. And it's part of why a lot of things don't translate very well. So, in James Lovelock's Gaia, what I see is someone raised in a thingly worldview, using a thingly language, trying to describe something subtle and profound. And ultimately, there's a reason why he ends up with the metaphor of the thing, because everything about his upbringing conspires to point it back into something that English is comfortable with. You feel like there could be a more profound book, perhaps, written about the exact same topic in one of these verb-centered languages, for which it would have been natural to talk about the process of unfolding and the relationships between things. Douglas and then Phil, go ahead.
From a medical standpoint, there was a book that I read recently. I can't remember the author's name, and I just read it, so I guess I'm getting older. Okay. It was called Never Get Sick Again. I'll tell it real quick. At 50 years old, he got sick. He was a very wealthy man. He's going to come to the solution of what it is through cellular type stuff, okay? That you're talking about, that dispels everything. So he's going to live longer to his 90s or 100, so he's going to make it. He didn't make it. At 76, he passed away. So that should tell something right there. It's not up to us. You follow what I'm saying?
Right.
Okay, so the mystery of life continues. Every time we get closer, we think we get closer, something else is out there. Then we find something else, and out keeps going and going and going. To me, that's the puzzle of the universe.
Yes. Yeah, these are tricky topics. And of course, part of what's tricky about them is that they are in some ways impractical because they're not concerned with whether they're useful to us. It's one of the great challenges with philosophy, trying to sort out, what is the value of philosophy. I heard someone once summarize it as the value of philosophy is not in the answers it gives you, but that it helps you to ask better questions that you can't ask without philosophy. Yeah, and the more philosophical perspective on the world is going to have that same impact on us. There's all kinds of things that seem like settled issues go back to being open questions. And in some ways, it gets in the way of pragmatic pursuit of immediate return on investment. But on the other hand, it means that we can pursue a lot more interesting things than that. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah. Douglas, I wish you hadn't said that because I'm 75. Thanks a lot.
Live long and prosper.
But anyway, I think we just caught it, as I describe it, between equal 1 and equal 2.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get people out of the city. I mean, most people, some people, I suppose that's easy enough, but most people, it's hard for them to get out of the city gates. I remember when I first started teaching, I was teaching color theory. There was this husband and wife who was in my class. The wife seemed to be doing okay. In fact, she was a reasonably good student, just for an ordinary person. But the husband had a lot of trouble. And I just kept on having trouble with him. And he kept fighting me. He kept asking the question, well, what is the mixture between the red and the yellow to get this color? He kept asking that. I said, you just have to kind of try it and then sneak up to it. And then I found out his wife finally told me, well, he's been for 30 years a machinist.
Yes.
Right? And he just want the measurements.
That's right.
And I finally told him, look, I can't tell you because different brands of paints have different ingredients that even they know that changes. And so therefore you have to be able to actually experience it in your sensation and maneuver to the point, the subtle point that you need. And he had a whole hell of a lot of trouble. Right. I passed him because he was giving a lot of effort, but nonetheless, I praised his wife, which made him happy. And so I think being so stuck in that situation has made us almost prisoners. That's hard to get out and experience sensations.
Right.
And even if we do, it almost seems like civilization, particularly with the market culture, had captured our sensations. Because if you ask most people, would you rather spend the weekend in Las Vegas with all those colors? Or do you want to spend a week in the wild jungle? And they'll say, oh, the bright lights of Las Vegas. It is so brilliant and bright. It rivals day. Right? Which is like, okay, I give up because they're captivated by the spectacle. I remember one of my friends, doing that. I think the Chinese Olympics, was that in 88 or 98 or whatever?
Right.
He said they were fantastic, and I said, no, I'm not interested in watching that. I'm not interested in watching a spectacle, which it certainly was, And he thought I would be fascinated because I'm an artist, and I said, no thanks. Particularly since it's Chinese, it's so spectacular. I said, no, I'm not into spectacles, so I just ignored it. So I think we have trouble because most people are captivated by spectacles. I remember in one meeting somebody says, oh, if I could have the dream of my wish, I wish I could be dating Cindy Crawford. And I said, which Cindy Crawford, the real Cindy Crawford or the Photoshop Cindy Crawford?
Right.
So he didn't answer that question, by the way.
Yeah, I imagine. Thank you, Phil. So I guess part of my point here is when we're trying to get an understanding of what we mean by the physiocratic worldview, when we're trying to get closer to understanding it, we run into trouble because it's so rare to have it presented in the modern era. And whenever it is presented, it's just like a few drops of vanilla extract in a large cookie batch. You know, you can smell the vanilla, but you aren't really getting close to vanilla. You're mostly having wheat and chocolate chips and, you know, whatever all the other ingredients are. And if we got too close to it, you know, it's like trying to take a swig of vanilla extract. It's nothing like we expect it to be. It's overwhelming and feels disgusting and it's just wrong. We know on every level of our cultural conditioning that we're not supposed to go there and that it's wrong, and we reject it. So it's part of what I was asked, I think in the very first one of these seminars I did last year, why do I like Kenneth Smith's writing? And one of the reasons I like Kenneth Smith's writing is that he is one of the few writers who writes very frequently from a physiocratic perspective. He often says sentences that you would only say if you were a physiocrat critiquing whatever the subject is at hand. And a lot of the favorite sentences that Sharon or Stephen or you or Donald or others quote out of these essays, they're often the thing that makes them ring, that gives them their force, is often the physiocracy in them. That it's such a novel way of looking at things compared to the way that we're normally taught or conditioned to look at things. So in addition to, you know, citing the Hegel, citing the Heraclitus, citing the Jonas, citing the Alexander, whenever I spot the references, I think the other thing I'm going to try to do going forward in this is whenever I spot him being especially physiocratic, I'll try to make a point of it, because it's one of our opportunities to see how differently someone describes something when they're describing it from that worldview. And for us, the challenge is whenever we read ancient writers, our inclination is to read them as moderns. We assume that they mean by the words and the concepts what we would mean by the words and the concepts. And if it doesn't really make sense, then we say, well, they must be primitive and not very good at communicating. You know, people do that all the time when they're reading the Greek philosophers and playwrights. And it's such a profound trap because it leads us to stop asking questions because we think we have the answer, because we projected our own worldview onto somebody else's text and extracted a reflection of ourselves from it and said, there, I see what Socrates means. He means what I mean. So really, he's a kind of modern. You know, and we say, and you know what? I agree with Socrates. We think it's really interesting that we agree with him when actually we're just agreeing with a reflection of ourselves because we're not actually reading Socrates in his native idiom. And I don't just mean the language, but I mean that physiocratic worldview. What would he mean if he wasn't talking to our perspective, but was talking from his own, is an entirely different answer. So going forward through this book, I'll do my best to draw out examples of physiocracy, but I thought I would start today by giving you know, those few book examples and those few essay examples. Oh, and for Joseph, the other example the link that I put earlier that I should have given you is the Paul Valery quote, which I'll post one more time in here. That's one of Kenneth Smith's favorite Paul Valery essays. Paul Valery is for those of you who don't know, he's a writer who, because he wrote in French and had to be translated into English, he's not nearly as well known among philosophy students as he should be. He's a spectacular essay writer, and he was writing right after World War I, when there was an enormous philosophical ferment as a reaction to the shock that the whole world could go to war against itself over something so bizarre and almost inexplicable, when they thought they were above all that. They were in the middle of those profound feelings of being the best of the best and the pinnacle of history, and we're going to form a brave new world. And then suddenly they were all at each other's throats. and enormous numbers of them died. And so afterwards, you get these philosophical writers like Valery who are going, whoa, there's something really important happening here, and we should try to understand it. So his essays are just fantastic. He's a great thinker. All right, so that was how I wanted to kick off today. So if we proceed through this essay, or at least this section of the essay on the ancient world now, with that in mind, we're going to see over and over he's using metaphors of biology to describe the entire world. And I want to just pick some of them out for itself. When he says that nature is a dynamic order of existence, by dynamism, he doesn't just mean cool. In the modern world, dynamism can mean whatever we want it to be. Ooh, that film was dynamic. Ooh, this quarter pounder, it's dynamic. Anything could be dynamic. We don't know what we mean by it. But he means a physiocratic and almost even a physics term, which is that Heraclitean idea that the structure of the cosmos is not made up of things, but is made up of forces that are in conflict with one another in such a way that they end up being harnessed to each other to create dynamically responsive systems that keep themselves whole. So he's talking about, insulin and glucagon in dynamic harmony to hold your blood sugar within a range. He's talking about the things that raise your blood pressure and the things that lower your blood pressure being harnessed together so that you don't get too far out of whack. He's talking about all of those ways in which the bow is strung so the wood and the string are in tension against each other, not destructively, but constructively to do work, to generate things. And that idea that everything that's real is generated out of dynamic tension like this is central to the concept of what an organism is, and it's central to the physiocratic perspective of the world. They say the whole universe is that the universe is not just a place full of stuff, the way that the modern world says it is. Even if we say there was a big bang and there was all this exciting stuff that happened, we still mean it's a place full of stuff. And maybe the stuff is expanding, but we still have a very thingly Cartesian, Newtonian perspective on the universe. But to the Greeks, everything, there don't just happen to be four forces, like physics says in the modern world. They don't just happen to be there, but rather the forces are opposed to each other and harnessed into each other to generate everything else that follows. And that there's more forces than just those four that are involved. That there are all kinds of levels of emergent order in which you have tensions working against each other to create sort of fountains of productivity that create the world and make it the way it is. And so they say the universe isn't a place, it's not a container, it's an organism. And it's not an organism the way a cell is an organism, but it's an organism in this deeper idea of the harnessing together of forces to create a self-perpetuating whole, a whole that builds itself, that unfolds itself, that is so complex that it's not a simple little cartoon, an either or. It's instead a process of becoming. And that's why they call it physis, becoming, because it has its energies inside of itself that are making it unfold new order, including us. Phil, you got your hand up, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I love Heraclitus leaving his writings to Artemis's temple.
Yes.
I mean, I think both Apollo and Dionysus is taken two extremes. They are opposing forces that are necessary, but I think in terms of civilization, it has to find a kind of moderate ground.
Yes.
To turn that force into a civilizing force that's not at extremes. So I think I do understand Nietzsche rebelling against Apollo and to go to the extremes, but he's went too far the other way, at least in terms of building a civil society that would continue. And I think Artemis had a degree of piety that understands not the extremes, enough that there remains within the process a degree of ambiguity, once again, not the exclusion of the middle, a degree of ambiguity in which the thing reveals itself and yet hides itself at the same time.
Mhm.
So there's always a surplus for it to uncoil in the future,
Yes.
in the next stage. And rather than say, you know, we will get to the bottom of this, right?
Right.
I think that's why I think, like, I mean, he could have left it at the temple of Apollo. He could have left it at the temple of Dionysus, but he didn't, right? And I think that degree was the compromise that was necessary for civilizations to move, because civilization is another organic process which is quite different from nature, but it need to emulate and be sympathetic with nature, but it exists on its own. And I think that modernity, in a sense, went too extreme in both ways, in some sense, right? So by saying that, according to Nietzsche, man, well, not man, but the Ubermensch is now the oracle.
Right.
Right. I mean, come on. I never felt myself to be the oracle.
Right. Me either. Right.
And so I think a degree of moderation and a degree of piety about your own deficiencies, I think is necessary. So that's what I thought. And I love that he left it to, you know, the muse
Yes.
of Artemis instead of like the god of war or the god of total intellect. So yeah, that was my comment, you know.
I like it. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, you see in this opening paragraph, he's running these same examples. So he says that this order of existence rules and run itself on its own. On its own. This is a refutation of the medieval perspective. And of course, the medieval perspective predates the medieval revolution. It predates Christianity, you know, winning the Roman Empire and becoming the great empire. I since last week, I did a bunch of reading. Oh, there's a website. I don't know if everybody has seen this website. I guess I should. It's called Early Christian Writings.com. And it is fantastic. It's the best. Anybody who hasn't seen this thing needs to see this thing. This guy has basically chased down every reference to a gospel, an epistle, an apocalypse, or any other form of early Christian writing, that whether we have it now or not, whether it was included in the Bible or not, whether it's realistic sounding or ridiculous sounding, they don't care. They're like, what were all of the things that were written before the canon was formed, before the medievals decided this is what is in and everything else is out? And it is fantastic to read this stuff. People were writing up a storm of works early on, and frequently you can see alternative versions of the same story that ends up in sort of the approved orthodox form in the canon when it's finally formed. You can find earlier versions that are missing sections, like the version of Mark, the earliest version of Mark we know about before the later medieval editors started adding things onto it. It ends with women going to the tomb, finding that it's empty, but then running away and not telling anybody. And then we're like, well, they didn't tell anybody. How do we know? And the answer is Mark was not concerned about that when he wrote his gospel. But the later people who were translating the book were like, I don't like this ending at all. And so they wrote an ending in which they turn around and went and they told the 12 disciples, and that's how we know. And it's like, yeah, but that wasn't in the original. That was tacked on in order to make it tidier. It removed the archaic qualities of the original, which are sort of, more bold and profound. So part of what I'm trying to get at with this by sharing this is that what we think of as the medieval worldview was arising at a much earlier stage within a smaller community inside of the ancient order. The Jews were struggling with themselves for who they wanted to become and what their theology was going to be around the time when history starts recording their struggles with the Romans. Christianity is struggling with the Jews and with itself for who it wants to be. There's an enormous battles back and forth for what's going to count as Christianity and what's going to count as heresy. A lot of what we think of as the later concerns with the absolute chasm between orthodoxy and heresy are being developed during the ancient order in these small communities, in Palestine. It's fascinating studying the history of this period. And it reinforces something that several people have brought up on these calls, which is that Kenneth Smith is not saying that there are these tidy lines in history and that before this point everybody was ancient and after this point everybody was medieval. On the contrary, he's saying this is an organism. It's not like an organism. In the Hegelian dialectic, it is an organism. Culture and civilization and history are organisms, and they are unfolding. And the predecessors of what becomes a fully blown worldview later is already growing and evolving and going through stages of development during the earlier period. And infrequently, it could only have come into existence because of its predecessor. Just like the baby gestates in the womb of the mother, you need there to be the predecessor for there to be the new life. And the dynamic between them, the struggle between them, really shapes the development of who the new life is going to be, both before birth and afterwards as they acculturate and wrestle for identity and so forth. So, this idea of a fixed set of truths that are the only right truths and that all the other truths are wrong and have to be stamped out seems to come from the first 200 or 300 years of Christianity, when Christianity wasn't an orthodox thing yet. The movement that arose to create an orthodox Christianity was just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of counter movements inside of what do I want to say, the brand new religion that was becoming. And later it wanted to tell the story that it started out orthodox from the beginning and that the heresies were all just spin-offs. But when you actually look at the history, it's the other way around. There was this enormous ferment of creativity out of which, canonizers arose who were like, okay, we need to pick some of this that's going to be the real stuff and everything else needs to go. And if we don't, and their argument was, if we don't do that, then who the hell are we? How do we even win, like the Roman Empire to our side if we can't even explain, well, what's Christianity and what's not Christianity? And so that preoccupation with the frame and what's inside the frame and what's outside the frame and creating an excluded middle was a major part. It was just like goes right into the DNA of how Christianity first arose. Sharon, go ahead.
I think the question I have is, as they decided what was included in the frame and what was not in the frame, I think that was about the time when Christianity became political.
Yes.
It was now used as a tool to control for people.
Yes.
It was no longer a mistake, a faith. It was the political power of control. And I think that's when they first constructed the scriptures. So what was left out and what was included, what was left out was going to be disruptive. And I think I've read the Gnostic Gospels. Yeah. And that's very interesting because a lot of it is contrary to what's in the actual Bible. So that link that you gave me is very interesting, and I'm going to really delve into it, because what got included in the Bible is what was available for political control at the time.
Yes. 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 And you can see why they had a big problem. The people who became the Orthodox religion, they had a big problem, which was people were writing books left and right claiming that Jesus did that or Jesus said that. And it was getting harder and harder to figure out what he actually did and said. And so they're on the one hand, you can sympathize with the desire to separate the wheat from the chaff and say, wouldn't it be nice if our canonical books actually said what he said and what he did? Wouldn't it be nice if the actual Jesus could be heard speaking through the works, and if that was what we centered on? But on the other hand, every so often Jesus would say something that was really inconvenient to the Roman Empire or to, the burgeoning Orthodox Christianity, and then they wouldn't be so. Then they were on the side, suddenly of the people that they were trying to suppress, because they're like, you know what, I kind of wish he hadn't said that. I wonder if maybe we could leave that part out, or, in the second draft, maybe I will just do a little editing here. And you can see some of those scenes right to the present day. I think it's Mark and Matthew that have two different responses to the question of whether Jesus has come to fulfill the law or to replace it. And in one of them, he says, well, now the whole of the law is to love God with all your heart and all your mind and all your spirit, and to love your neighbor as yourself is the second rule. And that's it. That's the new covenant. And in the other one, he says, oh, no, not one jot or tittle will pass from the law, as long as the world shall exist. You still have to be circumcised. You still have to be kosher. You still have to. And this is because there was a struggle between two communities, and they each wished Jesus had said something different. And it makes it hard for us today to figure out, well, which one did Jesus say? Because at least one of these people was, having Jesus say what they needed him to say for political reasons, so that their faction would have the authority of Jesus behind them for why they should win and the other guys should lose. And when you read some of these other works that they have in the early Christian writings, it's just fascinating how, I think I will use the word creative, a lot of these authors are in sort of deciding what it is that they want to have happened, regardless of what might have actually happened. But that struggle between orthodoxy and creativity, that struggle to try to create a common core and to coalesce into one straightforward religion that you could get the Romans to buy into. And especially in the early works, the desire to separate themselves from the Jews who were in the process of trying to revolt against Rome, and the Christians saying, "Oh no, not us. We're not troublemakers. We'll pay our taxes. Render unto Caesar. We'll please don't lump us in with them. If you got a problem, you take it out on them, not on us. We're your buddies." There's a whole lot of that. You could see that emerging in the 100s and 200s, and in the Orthodox line, where they're trying to get themselves compatible so that they can become a bigger religion and get backing. But what's interesting to me is the way in which what for people at the time was a purely tactical problem turned into core foundational parts of the next 1,000 years of history. Like, they set things in motion that they didn't know were going to become this big. And all the way to the modern era, we still have a problem with the excluded middle. The law of the excluded middle, the desire for things to be one way or another, true or false, right or wrong. Even in this post-medieval era, when we think we've freed ourselves to see the world as it objectively is, here we are still trying to apply the scholasticists, this is absolutely true and this is absolutely false, which traces all the way back to these arguments about what to include in the canon and what to exclude in the canon, and why it would become the central focus for the religion to make absolute distinctions between truth and falsehood, why there became such an intolerance of paradox and contradiction, and etc. Phil, go ahead, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I in a way, I hate saying it, but that frame sounds a hell of a lot like Cubism. Finding in the process of making itself, finding within the square and the rectangle. Yeah. I mean, that is combing over the details within the structure itself, rather than expanding beyond its dimensions. It just sounds very, very much like orthodox, I would say, maybe I shouldn't say orthodox, late modernism in a way, right?
Yeah.
The territory is in the rectangle. That's what it is, finding in the making. Okay, so thanks a lot. Just a brief comment there.
Sure. So let's see. I think this one is free too. So I'm going to share this as well. In the chat, I'm going to share a link to Gilbert Murray's book, 5 Stages of Greek Religion. It's another one of Kenneth Smith's favorites. I'll put the title into, because in this, Gilbert Murray tries to trace the transformations that he's aware of that went through the ancient Greek religion. And the first three stages are describing the rise of Greek polytheism, which is fascinating stuff. The fourth phase stage describes why the Greeks converted to Christianity. What was it about Greek history and the Greek experience that led them to want to give up their ancient polytheism for the promise of an incorruptible monotheism? Why would that be appealing? And then finally, his fifth chapter is the counter revolts when Justinian under the Romans tried to reimpose polytheism and tried to create, really, as far as we know for the first time, something like a Bible of polytheism as an answer to the Christian Bible. It's weird how little we look at that in the modern world, considering that we think that we see everything the way it actually is. It's really interesting to see Justinian attempting to...
Julian.
Sorry, Julian. Thank you.
The apostate.
Yes, the apostate Julian. Thank you for the correction. To see Julian doing that, see what he's trying to do, to see him retroactively trying to paint ancient Greek polytheism in the best possible light. It reminds one of the way that by the time Bach was composing his Baroque masterpieces, for most other people, the Baroque era was over and they'd moved on. Mm-hmm. And it was partially the reaction against that led Bach to do what he did. He's like, but wait, I like polyphony. But where are you all going? Look how cool this is. And so there's this quality to that of Julian. And as a result, it gives you a way to see the tension on that line between the ancient world and the medieval world, as it's defined first by the Christians reacting against the corruption of Rome, and then that line is counter-defined by Julian trying to say why we should go back and what we're losing. It's intriguing. Douglas and then Ginny. Go ahead, Douglas.
This is really good. I'm enjoying it. Okay, can you give this to 5 books that we can put a title down? I want to put them down. Okay, that would be great. Put 5 books like you were saying. And I would ask you, in your opinion, what do you feel is the philosophy of the Bible?
Okay, so let's tackle these one at a time. The second question we'll be at for the next year, but we can do a little bit of it today. But the 5 titles, they're all in the chat there. You can see the chat. I've listed them all. So the Gilbert Murray 5 stages, the Hans Jonas Phenomenon of Life, the Christopher Alexander, the 2 books, The Phenomenon of Life and the Process of Creating Life. Those are on the list. And then, of course, this book, Millennia and Microcosm, he's in this chapter, in this section on the ancient order, he's only going to give us a taste of what he's going to explore in the chapters to come, when he really unpacks his understanding of the ancient order and what makes it different from the modern order. So in the weeks and months ahead, we're going to do some really interesting work on this in this area. As far as the philosophy of Christianity that's in the Bible, even from the beginning of the orthodoxy, even from the point when a first canon was formed, there were not just extra canonical works that were suppressed. There were also extra canonical works that were embraced. A great deal of the theology of early Christianity isn't in the Bible anywhere. It's in some of the additional supporting works. How do you do, what's the process for a mass? What's the process for, a funeral or a birth or a marriage? A lot of that stuff is outside of the Bible, and a lot of it makes up the most fundamental parts of the gnosis, the experience of being in a Christian church, and yet it's nowhere to be found in there. The other thing that's interesting about the question you ask is that what you can see in the different works in the New Testament are snapshots of a number of different competing early Christian movements, many of which disagree with each other fairly dramatically. And the creators of the canon had to work pretty hard to figure out how to arrange them in such a way that their disagreements with each other would not be apparent. Putting Paul, who wrote earlier, after the Gospels, which were written later, does an enormous amount of that reconciliation work for them. If you set the Gospels aside and forget everything that you think you know about Jesus from the Gospels, and you just turn to the epistles, you will see that Paul's version of Christianity is like completely alien compared to the gospel writers. He has different value set. He has a different idea of what Jesus did and didn't do. There are a number of things that he never mentions. And by putting it after the Gospels, it creates the illusion that the reason he doesn't mention them is because he already knew them and he assumed everybody else did too. But if you restore the original order and put him first, in some cases, it seems like the reason he doesn't mention them is because those episodes had not yet been written.
Yeah.
Those were things that were added later that he didn't know about. It was the later Orthodox people, when they were making their Gospels, who added to Jesus's story to make him say things they wanted him to say and make him do things they wanted him to do. There's a lot of very interesting Bible scholarship going on for the last 40 years, where, people who have a level of understanding of linguistics so much better than we ever used to have in history are now tackling the problem of pulling apart the epistles and the Gospels to try to figure out how much of this was original and how much of this was inserted, and can we tell who did the insertions and what they were trying to do politically. What arguments were they trying to resolve by slipping something in there, between two passages. And sometimes it's really obvious because Jesus will be in the middle of saying something really striking and coherent, and then suddenly he's off on some other tangent, and then he picks right back up seemingly mid-sentence with where he was before the interruption. And you can sort of see the seams, right? Because the people doing the interpolation back then didn't know how to make it invisible. They were inventing the art of sort of inserting their own stuff in somebody else's mouth. And so they'd leave behind, Jesus would set up some wonderful rhyme or rhythm of a metaphor. This is like that, just like this is like, and then suddenly he's talking on some other subject. And then he comes back and says, like that. And you can tell there didn't used to be any of that text in there, right? It was one coherent, metaphor originally. So I think, if you want to know what's in there, there's a lot of books out there that work on this. There's books that work on the epistles to try to figure out how much of this was originally Paul and what was Paul's theology, and which of the epistles are clearly not Paul at all, but were written later. Like Timothy is like not Paul at all. And likewise in the Gospels, how much of it goes all the way back, how much of it goes back to the wisdom sayings that they preserved from Jesus, and then how much was inserted like sometimes as late as the 100s or 200s to resolve theological disputes that they were having later on. You can find references in the New Testament to historical events that hadn't happened yet in Jesus's time. And that's one of the things that they use as the sign of the fingerprints of the interpolators is when are they slipping in some reference to, the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which happened later. It happened after Jesus died, right? So he probably wasn't talking about that in 33 AD, since it didn't happen until 70 AD or whenever. There's a lot of good literature on this. I really encourage you to look at it. And part of what's fascinating about it is that when you peel away the additional layers that have been kind of crufted on there over the centuries by people trying to, sharpen this hatchet or that hatchet, it's really interesting to get closer to the original writings and see what people were trying to say before other people decided to use them to prop up their religion. Ginny, go ahead.
I think you should have a person-to-person meeting with Kenneth Smith since he's in Austin. And when he's doing that, I think you all should fly to Austin, and we can all meet each other in person.
After the pandemic, we should totally do that.
Yeah, because I want to meet you all. And I live in Austin. And since Kenneth Smith lives in Austin, why not?
You figure you got the center of gravity working for you there. Yeah, that might work out. I know he's interested, generally speaking. So
Seems to
Send you
be
my bill for the airfare, Rick.
yeah,
seems
right.
to be-
That's
seems to be San Diego's weather is better.
Did you,
He did
Joseph,
this.
did you say you're going to send the bill to me? Is that what you just said?
I'll
No,
take
no, to
Miami.
Rick. I'll send it
Oh,
to Rick. I
Rick,
would never
right.
send it to you. Don't worry about it.
He did this once when he was in Dallas,
yeah.
and finding seats for 8 or 10 people in a house that he owns is quite a problem.
It's full of books. Bookcases
It's
everywhere.
standing room only.
You stand on this side of the bookcase, and I'll stand on the other side, and we'll look past these short paperbacks. We'll look through the thing. Hi, is that you over there? What are you trying to say? I can't hear you through the insulation of all these books. Yeah, we'll arrange something. He's expressed a willingness to get together.
Somebody said, "Be here now."
Yeah. So
my nephew had his own IT business and also was in a music group, and he had his own plane. So he would very often fly his bandmates from location to location for gigs. Too bad that I think he sold his plane, but anyway,
yeah.
my mind is wandering.
You know, my favorite bit on the formation of the Christian canon, I can't remember which of the early church fathers says it, but we've actually got the writing from around the period where they were deciding what to include and what to exclude. And some of the decisions that went into it were things you could completely get behind. There was a lot of, okay, I don't think this book actually goes back to Jesus's time or to any of the disciples. As far as I can tell, this guy wrote this last year. So let's not include that in the canon. There's a lot of that trying to exclude the stuff that's purely fiction. And it's interesting. But my favorite bit of writing, and I wish I could remember who it was who wrote this bit, was about the inclusion of the Apocalypse of John, Revelations at the end. And he's saying, boy, I don't think that's the same John. First of all, I don't think that's the same John. Second of all, that's some batshit crazy stuff right there. And in his own words, he's saying more or less, that is some really crazy stuff. I would leave it out if I could, he says. But the problem is there's a sizable Christian community that loves this book. And if we don't include it, there's going to be a schism and we'll lose those guys. And our population, we're trying to build the population of the church, not reduce it. And so if there's some book that a huge percentage of the, church at that time is using, then we have to include it even if we think it's a really bad idea. And so he more or less says, okay, we're going to include this, but he might be quoting Han Solo. He's like, but I have a bad feeling about this. I think some bad things are going to result from this, but there's nothing we can do about it. And you look at the history of apocalyptic movements in Christianity.
The lost teachings of Jesus.
Right, you see a lot of they were right about that one. That one has caused no end of mischief in the history ever since. Phil and then Donald, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, just a question. Are you talking about the Council of Trent? I mean, or some other decision?
Even leading up to it.
Oh,
it was
leading
about
up to
100
okay.
years they spent off and on with different scholars trying to start sorting out.
Because the Council of Trent seemed to me was also very political in terms of the representation as well.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I mean Sharon's right. By the time you get to the point where the Orthodox Church has formed and is really trying to pull itself together, there's an enormous amount of politics. It's just it's huge. And of course, as we know, religion and politics always a problem when they get together. Donald, go ahead.
I follow a neighborhood group here, and some lady posted once asking for recommendations on churches to attend. And people gave her hundreds of examples, but recommendations. But as she went through this, she finally became clear what she wanted. The pastor had to have been in the pastoral tree of some modern pastor, they couldn't do music of a certain type because she didn't like the publishing house that controlled the rights to the music. And she insisted on a very specific interpretation of revelation. She wouldn't attend any church that didn't have, I think is like the saved had to be there to watch the unsaved be destroyed at the end of the world. If they went on ahead to heaven and missed the destruction, that was bad for her.
She didn't want any part of that.
She had to see them die. You know, I don't know, but it's this thing that you have talked about before of picking your God.
Right.
Something that's very modern. You know, almost it's right up there with whoever the modern Banasoi was, who added multi-level marketing to Christianity.
Yeah.
Enough of my cynicism, but this cynicism followed by stoicism sort of got us through those bad years there around the turn of the first millennium.
Yeah. You know, and the reason that I'm belaboring this stuff is twofold. One is when I said it's a very modern thing to think that you can pick what God is like. On the one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, the roots of that go all the way back to this argument over orthodoxy happening in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. And that it's one of the things that was really distinctive about the movement that would eventually lead to the medieval revolution, is that that's exactly what they were doing to try to shape the religion into its most appealing and form that could grow the most. They understood that in order to, they saw themselves as competing with the Jews that didn't embrace Jesus. They saw it as when they weren't initially thinking about we're going to be the religion for the whole world. They just wanted to beat those guys. And you can see it from the writing. They say so. You know, some of these early church fathers spend an inordinate amount of time talking about how they got to beat the Jews because, you know, otherwise they figure they'll lose, right? You know, if they can't beat those guys. And hitting on the idea of a growth religion that focuses on Gentiles in order to appeal to a larger population was originally not done for its own sake, but just to achieve this tactical end that they wanted. They figured if they couldn't seem to win the logical arguments. You know, the rabbis were very good, as they still are to this day, remarkably good at intellectual debate and discussion. And it was ticking off the early church fathers of the Christians. And so they said, well, at least if we could just grow a lot, we could win the argument by force of population. And then once they hit upon that mechanism, it sort of led to the desire to become more general, more appealing, maybe push aside some of that, you know, saying that a rich man can't get into heaven stuff. There's a lot of editing happened in order to try to make it appealing after that. And it became an end unto itself. It sort of transformed into what became the Catholic, i.e. for everybody, church of the medieval order. Not, again, distinguished from the Catholic Church of the modern order, which is a different, although it doesn't want to say so, it's a different kind of entity because it's living in a modern epoch instead of a medieval epoch. So part of the reason that I bring this up is for that. I wanted to correct what I said last week and say, well, it might be a modern thing to think that you get to choose God, but its roots go all the way back to the early arguments in the Christian community about what's going to be orthodox and what's not going to be orthodox. And in that way, I'm not trying to dilute what I said last week, but what I'm trying to do is change it from being a category definition, which would be noetic, to being an organism definition, which would be gnosic, and say, this has always been a central feature of this line that led to modernism, that it has been wrestling with this problem of how much do you get to edit God or shape God to make him more appealing. And it's one of the things that, it's one of the reasons why the Jews didn't like early Christianity, is that period when the early Christians were writing books left and right, including people who'd never been there or seen any of it or heard Jesus say a damn thing. And they're writing books saying, well, Jesus said this and he did that. And there's the Jews shaking their heads going, what even is this? This is, you can't put words in. I mean, even if we're all wrong and Jesus is real, you can't put words in his mouth. That's not okay. And, you know, there's the early Christian church doing exactly that. So there were some major struggles going on around that very issue of, does God tell you who he is, or do you get to tell everybody else who God is? And that was the basis of the schism. And of course, that's gone right into the modern forms of religion. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So for Donald's lady, she probably needs to just stay at home.
Right.
It would be a good idea if she just stayed at home, right? And
she's met God and he is her.
that's right. So just stay at home. Well, the thing though that two comments I want to have. You keep
Please.
talking about the orthodoxy of religion, and one of the things that I've learned over the years is that there was such plurality in the orthodoxy, right?
Yes.
That it was never ever clean, pure orthodoxy.
Right.
And the second point you just made is very, very valid, because the most of the Christian teaching came from Paul, St. Paul, who never spent a day at Jesus's knee. He had
Right.
his conversion on the road to Damascus, right? And that's one of the, I want to say, mysteries, or that's one of the unusual things. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their gospels, and that was it. But Paul wrote to all the early Christian churches. A lot of the discipleship occurred with him. And the other thing, when we were putting this biblical structure together, this canon, which demonstrated that it was really a tool for political control, I think it was done in Latin,
Mm-hmm.
where very few of the populace at that time could read Latin.
Right.
So only particularly on the Roman Catholic side, so only the priests and elders in the Catholic Church knew what was in there. And I think that's one of the things that Martin Luther did. He started translating the Bible and
Mm-hmm.
brought a lot of irony.
Mm-hmm. That's such an important point. Yeah, when Kenneth Smith writes earlier, I think, was it this essay or the previous one, when he says that one of the weird innovations, unintentional, of the medieval world was the split between the Banausoi and the Douloi, that for the first time in Western civilization brought the Banausoi fully into focus. He's talking about that split formed by reading Latin or not reading Latin. You know, the people who were allowed to be initiated into the mysteries of the language, who were allowed to become part of the structure of the hierarchy above the lay people. You know, this became the seedbed for the development of the Banausic character type,
Mm-hmm.
who had always been there in history in various places, but who the Greeks couldn't quite clearly see. They sort of knew that Banausic activities did something to your mind, but they didn't entirely understand that they represented a third character type separate from the Douloi and the Aristoi. They had a tendency to attribute the behavior of Banausoi to either Dulic people or to Aristic people, and to not see how it formed its own part of the triad of the dialectic. But by the time the medieval epoch reached its culmination, literally nobody in the world could mistake what was going on with the degree of corruption that happened with the insulated ivory tower hierarchies when they were cut off from the world. So it's such an important point, Sharon. Thank you. Yeah, and you know, hand in hand, the other thing that I didn't say last week that I really should have is, you mentioned the ecumenical movements in religion, and they're so important. They've been there, you know, if we go back to the very beginning of Christianity, we not only see a fight among different competing factions for orthodoxy, but at the exact same time, we see other people involved in ecumenical behavior. And Paul does a certain amount of this too, where different churches are talking to each other and interacting with each other and sharing stories and sharing ideas. And an enormous amount of community building results from that ecumenical movement within Christianity. Correct. And that was a value system from the ancient epoch that carried over side by side with the Orthodox movement. And the two of them sort of coexisted, often uncomfortably, but they coexisted throughout the entire history of Christianity right up to the present. You know, there's a reason why Christianity is a source of both things. It's the same religion that can have inquisitions and purges and crusades can also have Martin Luther King Jr., or liberation theology, or just the whole ecumenical movement. The idea that it's good to talk to each other, it's good to compare our differences, it's good to break bread together, even if we don't agree on everything, to form a larger community. That's always been one of the important things to come out of it. Phil, and then Douglas. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I mean, the thing about don't let them win, didn't George Bush have a simpler answer? Go shopping, because if you don't, you're going to let them win. That seemed to be a much simpler solution.
I'll never forget when he said that. That was just an Orwellian moment. If you really want to beat the terrorists, go shopping, he says. And we're all like, wait, what? Didn't buildings just collapse in New York? Shopping? Really? It's like, yeah, don't let the market be hurt. That's the important part. Douglas, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm Jewish, but I see Jesus, okay. Understand, okay. I mean, a lot of people don't like that about that, but okay. I can put him as king, or I play my chess pieces, okay. I've got the other one, the Buddha's there and all these. But here's the thing that gets me. You have, and right now in the modern time, you have 5 or 6 different Christianities, because I've tried to go to these different churches to see what would happen. And every single one was Episcopal, Baptist, they're all telling something else. I said, where am I here? I wanted to know for myself. So I went to all the different ones, and I saw different performances and stuff, that were completely different, okay?
Right.
So I guess to the membership that they have, they're collecting funds, and so on. I think they tell it a whole different story, every single one of them.
Yeah, it's a major issue. It's at this point, you really have to call it a feature of Christianity that despite 2,000 years of concerted effort to create a single religion with a single orthodoxy, it has many different belief systems coexisting side by side, all identifying as Christianity, and that's just the way it is. It's for considering that the triumph of the orthodoxy was the medieval epoch. It's ironic that that despite everything that they could do, they couldn't reduce it down to a single religion, that it is multiple perspectives on the same events. It's just, I think at this point, you can't call it a bug. You have to call it a feature. It's just essential. It's part of the cultural genetics of the religion.
Yeah, but how can you do without the snake handlers?
Excuse me one second. Now it's become entertainment.
You missed my comment, but how can you do without the snake handlers? Come on.
Sharon, go ahead.
Well, the orthodoxy never started as an orthodoxy. I said there is always plurality in that orthodoxy.
Right.
So if we didn't start there, we can't end there.
That's right. That's right.
And so to Douglas's point, I think that the plurality you see within the Christian bodies, is that any different than the plurality you see within Hinduism, within Buddhism, or is a manifestation of plurality of practices and faiths and beliefs just that of any religion, no matter what it is?
People have diverse perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not unique to Christianity.
No.
No, but what he's saying is so true. It's become not what it was. It's becoming, I think it's like I go to watch the wrestling matches, okay, and their entertainment and so on, okay. I think religion is becoming entertainment. Most of it.
Certainly, this is something that's going to come up over and over in this book, Millennia and Microcosm, is what is the nature of religion in the modern world, and how is that different from the nature of religion in the ancient or medieval world? So, whether religion serves the same function in modern civilization that it did in the previous ones is a question we're very much going to explore. So in this opening paragraph, part of the reason that I spent that time talking about Christianity is that when he says nature is a dynamic order of existence that rules and runs itself on its own, that is a specific response to the medieval worldview, right? The medieval worldview says there wouldn't even be a world if it weren't for God, and that at every instant, God is keeping it from dropping into the abyss. The only reason anything happens or continues is because of God's relentless, involvement. It was one of the ways in which the founding fathers of the US were essentially heretics from the perspective of the medieval perspective, because they were deists who believed in a deity who set things in motion, and then after that wasn't required to be directly involved for the world to keep going. And this was a radically different perspective than the medieval perspective of a God ever present, always keeping things going. In fact, it harkens back to the ancient perspective in many ways. It's sort of like an attempt to marry the ancient worldview of a cosmos that creates itself and keeps going by itself with the medieval worldview of a cosmos created by a God. The deists ended up defining the world as a compromise in which, God did create it and set it in motion, but after that, it became like the ancient cosmos that keeps itself going and keeps itself running. They tried to marry the two together. And you can see the seams of it, because the big difference is that in the ancient worldview, remember we said last week, time is infinite. It goes infinitely back and infinitely forward. The universe always was and always shall be, says Heraclitus. He's postulating a universe that is an organism that maintains itself, whereas the medieval perspective was a universe with a beginning and an ending. And the deists, in trying to split the difference between the two, are creating a universe with a beginning, but not necessarily with an ending, right? God set it in motion, but it can be infinite from there on out. So again, they're trying to have it both ways. They want their Aristotle, they want their Socrates, and they want their Plato, but they don't want to be burned at the stake and be heretics. So they need God to be essential. So they have God be a clockwork God who sets the mechanism in motion and then lets it go after that on its own. It's a very distinct position. And when Kenneth Smith says that, the universe as seen from the ancient worldview rules and runs itself on its own, it's excluding any need for the medieval deity. It's excluding any need for a transcendental source of meaning. It's saying that the cosmos is the source of meaning. And therefore, any deities that exist must be expressions of the cosmos rather than outside of it. So not because one is true and one is false, but just to help us understand the differences in these two different optics, so that we get the ability to shift back and forth and say, well, what would Thomas Aquinas say? Oh yeah, well, what would Heraclitus say? We could start to predict a little bit if we keep these things in mind. And then with those optics in mind, we can then turn it around and look at our own modern perspective and start to see its curious idiosyncratic features that until now we've taken for granted. Ginny and then Phil. Go ahead, Ginny.
Yeah, when I think of the medieval period, I think of everyone being religious, but I do wonder how many people, I'm wondering what percentage of people really were atheists and agnostics. You sometimes,
It's a fantastic question. The medieval church hierarchy complained endlessly about the paganism of the population.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they Christmas, Halloween, Saint Bridget, Saint Thor. There's an endless array of features of the medieval religion that are present as compromises to allow a basically heathen rural population to conform with a Christian urban hierarchy who was imposing the rule that you had to be Christian. And when they couldn't get them to do that, they would just redefine what the population was already doing as Christian so that they could be nominally Christian and claim success to Rome that they had converted the countryside, when what they really did is said, okay, Bridget isn't a goddess, she's a saint. And Halloween isn't a celebration of, passing through the veil to the pagan world. It's now, All Hallows Eve, which is going to be a saints festival. So there was this process that was very important to declaring victory, shall we say. And it's part of why, as late as the Renaissance, you've got the Inquisition happening, where they're able to root out heathenism and paganism all over the place, because a lot of nominally Christian practices were essentially still heathen pagan practices with sort of a Christian blessing on top of them. Very interesting history, which I meant to mention this week, so I'll mention it right now because it plays into what you said. Most people don't know who was the greatest victim as a group of the Spanish Inquisition. And the answer is it was the Basques. In the mountains of northern Spain and southern France, the Basques were a classic example of a group who was only nominally Christian, but still preserved a whole bunch of their ancient Basque mythology under the, blessing of this is Saint so-and-so instead of Goddess so-and-so. We'll put a Christian church on top of this holy spring instead of doing it without. And so the slaughter of Basques was incredibly fierce under the Spanish Inquisition. A lot of the worst of the, where they applied the Malleus Maleficarum and other witch hunts tools was done against the Basques in order to root out heathenism and paganism and complete the genocide that had only been nominally done earlier but had never been finished. So it depends on when you're looking at the period in history, but the medieval hierarchy believed that they were more successful at Christianizing the cities than they were at Christianizing the countryside. And in the medieval epoch, most people lived in the countryside. Village culture was still the dominant culture of Europe up until the modern era. So yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. Phil, go ahead.
Well, Kenneth Smith did mention in the beginning of the modern thing,
yeah,
Pico della Mirandola.
Pico della Mirandola.
I mean, he was actually brilliant in my mind,
sure,
in making that transition, because the way he put it, man was the only thing that was left incomplete purposely by God, right? Go finish yourself. I mean, that is the birth of free will, if I've ever heard of it. I mean, you're on your own, go free yourself. So instead of being cast out of the Garden of Eden, no, I'm letting you go. You got to finish yourself, because I'm giving you this sort of freedom, incompleteness.
Yes.
And I immediately thought of Michelangelo late sculptures.
Yes.
Those of you that seen it. Yes. I mean, it's like wonderful how he left the figures incomplete, struggling to emerge from the rock.
Yes.
It's like it's beautiful compared to, let's say, David, which is also a magnificent sculpture, by the way.
Sure. Yeah.
But nonetheless, and that led me to thinking about Heidegger. That seemed like the calling of Dasein to manifest himself. I mean, really, that transition into the future was, I mean, he pinpointed the guy who made it possible.
Yeah.
Well, that that what seemed to be a slight opening to really crack open into like, no, you're on your own. You got to do it, right?
Yes.
In fact, you're gonna do it, because the animals can't do it, even the angels can't do it, right? It's like, I think that is a wonderful transition that didn't break the law that much, but it cracked it open a whole lot.
Yeah.
My goodness.
It's funny because when people read Kenneth Smith claiming that, one of the decisive moments in the emergence of the modern epoch is Pico della Mirandola's essay on the dignity of man, they're like, who? How can that possibly be an important point in history? None of us have even heard of this guy. But, like you say, you read it and you can sense the intuitive power that he's tapping into. You can see why that could become the founding idea of an entire movement, that we are incomplete and we have the freedom to complete ourselves.
No, not only the freedom, the duty.
Freedom and duty, both.
That's right.
Both. And that could become an entire worldview for how you could organize society and culture and religion and yourself and everything else. It all follows out of that idea of the freedom of the will and the duty of the will to act, rather than to be submissive to nature or to God. You must act, and you're driven to act, and everything about progress, the deists, that set up the American Constitution, the Protestant Reformation, everything all falls into place around the organizing principle of that. It's really quite interesting, and part of what's fascinating about it is that its problems, the terrible consequences that would emerge, aren't visible at all from within it. From within it, it's exhilarating. I mean, it's marvelous. It seems to explain everything and set everything in motion.
So,
and yet,
so being cast out of the Garden of Eden is a moment of liberation.
Exactly. Instead of a great shame, it's a great joy, right? They inverted the medieval message and said, God did this on purpose. I mean, what? He's God. You think he didn't know we were going to eat from the apple? Of course he knew. This was to open the doors to us, to allow us to go forth and finish ourselves. It was, it seemed to explain things that didn't make sense in the previous worldview. Yeah, you're right. Pico's very clever, what he's done there. Douglas, go ahead.
Okay. When will we take responsibility? The word responsibility. Okay. Let's give it to everybody else, okay, and everything. Okay.
Yes.
But our own, I guess each of us has to take our own responsibility to get a clear understanding of what's going on.
Yes. Well, and now you're pointing at some of the Achilles heels of Pico's great formative perspective, which is, it feels very liberating, and it takes a while to understand that what we've been liberated from is all of the hard parts of philosophy. Freedom from what? Freedom to what? Duty to whom? What are our responsibilities? All of the problems that philosophers have been scratching their heads over for thousands of years actually just seem to melt away within the perspective that Pico describes in the essay. You can see why pragmatism and utilitarianism go on the rise as perspectives, so they seem to fit with it very well, and they all share that same Achilles heel, which is, how do we decide when things come into conflict? What's the right thing to do? The hard questions, and they're not answered by any of this. This is modernism's weak spot. Our blind spot is exactly the hard things that we should be most paying attention to. Instead, those are the things we most look away from. And what we attend to is, what do we want? What do we feel like doing? What do we feel like our duty is? Who do we feel like God should be so that we can go pick the right church to join?
The Beatles had it right when they said, "You are you and I am me, and we are all together," and that whole thing. And then the Beatles song was terrific.
That's right. So, but it's difficult. It's sort of it's a masterful accomplishment to make something like an essay like what Pico did in such a way that the blind spots all vanish, precisely until you hold it up side by side with the ancient perspective on the exact same questions, with the medieval perspective on the exact same questions. When you can't ignore the differences, it's like if you have two copies of the same photo and you can't see what the differences are, but you use a piece of software to flip back and forth between them once a second. Yeah. And now the one thing in the underbrush stands out because it flickers as you go back and forth. And now you can't ignore it anymore, that it's completely missing from one picture, but it's a major feature of the other, like the tiger crouching, ready to pounce. Yeah. It's like, that's how it is when you try to understand the modern worldview. It's not until you place it exactly overlapping with the others that you can see that there's a big hole in the place where medievalism provided one set of answers and the ancient epoch provided another set.
You have The Lord of the Flies. You know that book, The Lord of the Flies? There you go, right there. The whole thing, what goes on.
Right. Yeah, the critique of Nietzsche and Kenneth Smith and others from this particular existentialist philosophical tradition is that there is underlying a great deal of noble language there is a disturbing amount of nihilism and might makes right that it all ends up boiling down to. The things that it removed from consideration are the things that keep us from being at each other's throats. And to say that whoever has the most money can buy whatever they want, even if it's slaves, even if we don't call them slaves, if they're slaves de facto, is to roll back a great deal of philosophical consideration about the dignity of human beings, and to say, well, that doesn't matter. All that matters is what do you want to do, and what do you have the capacity to impose on others. It is a weirdly self-satisfied, pseudo-sophisticated form of barbarism. It's kind of shocking, and that is so out of sync with how moderns think of themselves that we really don't want to hear that criticism.
Yeah.
And it's part of why people despise Kenneth Smith. It's why the letters columns to Comics Journal were so full of hate mail, was because people are like, you can't say we're barbarians. You can't say we're morally incompetent. That's not okay. That's heresy. You have to praise us. You can't criticize us. It's not okay. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, but I like especially what you say, the silencing of the multiple perspective is what keeps you from seeing the blind spot. Yes. I mean, that is actually very, very important. The other thing I want to comment is that's exactly the question that was asked Hammurabi when he created the laws, right?
Right.
Somebody says, well, couldn't we just have the good stuff? and he says, no, you have to have both of them.
Yes.
Because you got to be responsible for both of them. You know, I do believe, though, it does seem luring to say, just give me the good stuff.
Right? Any infant understands the impulse, and as adults, we remember the impulse. Why can't I just have the cookie? You keep the spinach and I'll eat the cookie. Why not? We know how that desire feels. Thanks, Phil. Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the low points for Athens in the Peloponnesian War was the Melian decree, the island of Melos, where they wanted Melos, who were Dorian, that is Spartan, basically, to join the Delian League. And they weren't having it. They said, we want to sit this one out. And finally, Athens explained it to them.
Yeah.
The powerful do what they must.
They do what they will.
Do what they will. The others suffer what they must. And that's what's going to happen to you.
Yes.
And there was during that war probably a breakdown of what we would think of the glory that was Athens. You know, afterwards, both Plato and Aristotle are sort of, how do I become a good man in a city that's no longer capable of raising up good men?
Yes.
You know, so.
Well, Diogenes with his lantern.
Or yeah, he's looking for something, are you?
He says, can I find one honest man in this entire marketplace? That's like a trenchant criticism for the city that once prided itself as being, you know, the center of philosophy. And
yeah, with Pericles' death, the beginning of the war.
Yeah. I'm playing a game.
So some of these things, no epic is pure.
Right.
I mean, Athenians knew power.
Right.
You know, I mentioned once before when you're talking about maybe they didn't have the Banasoi clearly bracketed, but Aristophanes and other, when Cleon, who was rich as a kind of an aristos because he tanned hides,
right?
You know, stood up and said, I'll go win this battle up at what's the Kaikara. And they said, idiot, no chance, but go ahead, have a go at it. And he won it. It was sort of like, the aristocracy has lost control.
Yes.
If Cleon can go win a battle against the Spartans, well, Jesus, there's no point in us being Aristoi. It just doesn't make any difference.
Yes.
Enough.
Yes. So we'll wrap up here, and next week we'll really start moving through this essay faster. But I thought it would be useful to spend some time today comparing and contrasting the perspective of the physiocratic world. So that opening paragraph about in the ancient section on page 15 and that finishes up on page 16, it's well worth going over it a few more times and thinking about, at first it reads to a modern reader like Kenneth is arbitrarily deciding to use biological metaphors because he feels like it. We feel like they don't really apply. We know better. As moderns, we know that the real metaphors you're supposed to use are math and logic, not biology. And if he starts talking about, the breathing and organic structure and regeneration, we're like, yeah, whatever. You don't really mean that. We're all really machines and the universe is a big machine, and we all know that. But to get to the ancient worldview, you have to be able to set aside that value judgment of the modern and say, what if I thought like an ancient and the world really was like an organism, more than it was like a logical syllogism or a bunch of measurements? What if there really are systems that are designed to keep things healthy, forces working with and against each other at the same time? So the breathing of the planet, the water cycles of the planet, the carbon cycles of the planet, all of this really does work similarly to how our own bodies try to stay within healthy limits. And what if you were raised from a young child to see everything, the rocks, the air, the sun, as part of a living system that was keeping itself in harmony? How would you think differently about the structure of the mind, about the structure of a culture or a city? And if you can start to see that, then if you read Philip Wheelwright's translation of Heraclitus, some of his sentences, some of his fragments where he talks about that a people needs to fight for the laws of a city as fiercely as it fights for its city walls when invaders are outside. He's talking about the lawfulness of an organism, its inner nature and drives that allow it to stay sane and whole and complete. And that if you don't fight for that, then you cease to be an organism, you become a mechanism and you collapse.
Yeah.
All of that is inherent in this perspective that he's trying to bring to bear. So that's it for this week, and we'll pick this up again next week and see if we can wrap up the ancient and move on to the medieval.
Well, we're still on this though, right?
We are. We're
Okay,
still
all
on.
right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rick.
That was very good.
Hey,
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot.
that
Thank
was
you.
very, very good. Thank
I
you.
learned a
Thank you
lot.
for having.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
thank
for having
you.
this.
Hey,
Bye,
Rick.
everyone.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye,
Hey,
Joseph.
Rick. Bye-bye, everyone. Have you
Hey,
heard of
hey, Rick.
viable systems model really quickly? Have you
Say
heard
that
of
again, Joseph?
something? Have you heard of something called the viable systems model?
No, I'd love to. You want to bring it next week?
Yeah, I could just, I can bring it. I'll just post it in the chat next week.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Hey, Rick.
Yeah, Donald.
Yeah, we talk about this different worldview, and there are two fiction authors that strike me. One, there was a series of kind of science fiction by Doris Lessing. I don't think it was ever very popular, but it was a series of like 8 books, I think, 7-8 books called Canopus and Argos Archives.
Really?
Yeah. And in there, it's sort of like planetary feng shui, leading to kind of galactic, that you want to live a good life. You got to get your planet kind of organized
Yes.
Get your solar system straight and stuff. It's really different. And then there are, of course, someone that Kenneth introduced me to. That didn't come up with Kenneth, but in the works of Stanislaw Lem, the late Polish writer,
Right.
you know, he has a lot of stuff where there's the sort of first contact stories, only no one can realize there's contact.
Ah,
You know, because, you know, like, well, many people probably seen bad renditions of Solaris, you know, with like George Clooney, which is but Tarkovsky, the Russian, is that Solaris is literally, it's like Gaia, it's a living planet.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, that's trying to communicate,
Yes.
but they're trying to explore it. You know,
Right.
it never occurs to them. It's just alive. But there are
Right.
other things like that, of stories that Lem tells, which help you imaginatively change your viewpoint of what is alive or an organism.
Yeah.
Like, especially say like rocks. Maybe they just have a slow metabolism and nothing happens except over not just millennia, over millions or billions of years, you know.
Yes.
Things like that. And so it's very difficult to recognize that they're alive or communicate with them. And that, I think kind of, one time Kenneth kind of recommended some of these works because they sort of, you need to change your perspective. What can be an organism?
Yes.
And anyway, I just thought I would mention it if you had it. Oh, and there's something else I was going to show you. It's really good. This is my 1925 edition of
Beautiful.
Gilbert Murray's The 5 Stages of Greek Religion.
I love that book.
I do. I found this at a used bookstore, and it's one of my pride and joys, I think. I don't think it's older than my father, yet alone older than me, but
Right. Right.
you know, but it is. So I'll go now, but I kind of like having this really old copy of a really old book.
Yes. I'm so glad you have it.
No, I have his book on Greek drama too.
Oh, yes.
And I also have, none of these are first editions, but they are old. This is the second edition. And I think on the others, on the other one, I have third edition or something.
Rise of the Greek Epic.
The Rise of the Greek Epic.
That's the one I haven't read yet. I really want to.
Oh, well.
Have you? Is it good?
You know, I just don't have the memory of that. I'm sure I read it. I wouldn't have bought 2 copies of it if I
Right.
if I didn't think it was good. Kenneth does that sometimes. It's like, if there's a good book, like I was just reading the preface to this, like E.R. Dodds was Gilbert Murray's student. And so everybody knows the Greeks and the Irrational, which is a very good book also.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many, like every time I see a copy, I just buy it. I know I have a copy. I know I've read it. You know, it's just like, well, this is such a good book. Somebody, the wrong person,
be rewarded for selling it.
The wrong person will buy it or something like that. So,
it needs to be cherished.
Right. Well, I mean, Kenneth sells books like that, and they're getting harder and harder to find.
They are.
Because there's no Well, there's no market for them.
There's sort of an anti-market that drives them out of circulation.
Yeah. Well, I'll see you next week.
Looking forward to it. Bye, Stephen.